The formal end of Roman rule in Britain is often marked by Emperor Honorius's rescript of 410 AD, a terse instruction for the province's cities to look to their own defence. This message, more a recognition of an existing reality than a decree, sealed the fate of a land long connected to the empire. The withdrawal of the last legions left a profound and unfillable strategic void, dismantling a centralized military structure that had maintained security for centuries. Without the discipline and organization of the Roman army, the province's vast road network and fortified coastal defenses became increasingly difficult to maintain against persistent raids from Picts in the north and Irish seaborne incursions in the west. The systemic decline has begun. Public building projects ceased entirely, and the great civic basilicas, baths and forums of towns like Verulamium and Caleva Atrebatum fell into disrepair, their monumental stonework slowly repurposed for humbler structures. The intricate mosaic floors of once lavish villas became covered in layers of soil and debris, as the aristocratic lifestyle they supported faded into memory. The highly monetized Roman economy unraveled, with coin circulation plummeting and a return to more localized, subsistence-based systems of trade and exchange. This shift from an urban, integrated society to a fractured agrarian one profoundly altered the character of the island. The political landscape fractured just as the physical one decayed. The unified provincial administration, which had once governed Britain through a series of appointed officials, disintegrated, replaced by a patchwork of local strongmen and petty chieftains vying for control. The historian Gilders, writing a century later, described this era as a time of civil strife and social breakdown, where the Britons, weakened by famine and internal conflict, were easy prey for external forces. His account of a period of temporary prosperity and renewed confidence, a brief Indian summer for the sub-Roman elite, only serves to highlight the subsequent collapse when that fragile order proved unsustainable against new threats. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. This period of instability was exacerbated by the changing relationships with Germanic mercenaries who had been a part of the Roman defense strategy. These foederati, once paid in coin and provisions to guard the eastern coasts against raiders, found their contracts unfulfilled by a non-existent central authority. Without the Roman framework to hold them in check, these armed groups became a destabilizing presence, transforming from paid protectors into independent warlords seeking to carve out their own spheres of influence. Their presence, initially a solution to the island's vulnerability, ultimately became a major contributor to its profound transformation. The conditions were now perfect for a new chapter to begin, one written not in the Latin of the imperial courts, but in the guttural tongues of the North Sea. Seafaring Germanic peoples from the North Sea littoral began a period of sustained settlement in Britain during the 5th century. The primary groups involved were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, originating from regions that are now part of northern Germany, Denmark, and the Low Countries. Archaeological evidence confirms their presence across a broad geographical area, with their arrival marked by a distinct shift in material culture. Excavations of early burial sites, particularly in the south and east of the island, have yielded grave goods that are unmistakably of Germanic origin, including square-headed brooches, pottery with stamped decorations, and distinctively shaped cremation urns. These finds demonstrate a cultural discontinuity from the preceding Romano-British period. The settlements themselves were typically small, agrarian villages composed of timber-framed halls and sunken-featured buildings, a clear departure from the Roman-style villas and urban centres. This process of migration was not a single coordinated invasion, but a series of piecemeal landings by diverse groups, each establishing their own foothold. Over time, these small communities consolidated into larger political entities. By the 6th and 7th centuries, this consolidation had led to the emergence of powerful kingdoms such as Kent, Sussex and Essex in the south, and Mercia and Northumbria inland. The development of these polities was often driven by military conquest and the subjugation of neighbouring groups, transforming the political map of the island. The establishment of these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms resulted in the gradual displacement of the native Britons, whose sub-Roman culture was either absorbed or pushed to the western fringes of the island. The linguistic and cultural transformation was profound. The Brittonic Celtic languages, which had been spoken throughout the island, gave way to the dialects of the newcomers, which would eventually form the basis of what is known as Old English. Place names across large parts of Britain changed, with Latin and Celtic names being replaced by Germanic ones, a linguistic fossil record of the population shift. This cultural transformation was fundamental, replacing the Romano-British social and legal systems with new structures based on Germanic kinship and customs. The island's identity was fundamentally remade, setting it on a new historical trajectory, away from its Roman past and toward its Anglo-Saxon future. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the 6th and 7th centuries were defined by a complex and often violent struggle for supremacy, a period that historians later termed the Heptarchy. While this term suggests 7 distinct kingdoms — Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Wessex, Sussex, and Kent — the reality was a dynamic and ever-shifting political landscape with smaller kingdoms rising and falling in influence. This era was characterized by a series of powerful rulers known as Bretwalders, who exerted a temporary overlordship over their rivals. Northumbria's King Edwin and Mercia's King Penda, for example, dominated their respective eras through military strength, forging temporary alliances and exacting tribute. Their reigns, and the wars that defined them, are documented in chronicles like Bede's Ecclesiastical History, which serves as a foundational source for understanding this period of political consolidation. Simultaneously, a more profound transformation was underway: the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons. This process unfolded along 2 distinct fronts. From the south, missionaries dispatched by Pope Gregory the Great, beginning with Augustine in 597 AD, sought to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons from Rome. They landed in Kent and, with the support of King Ethelbert, established the first mission in Canterbury. This Roman mission prioritized a top-down approach, aiming to convert the ruling class first, in the belief that their subjects would follow. Their work brought a new, Latin-based ecclesiastical structure, complete with dioceses and cathedrals, to the kingdoms of the south. From the north, a different strain of Christianity arrived from Ireland and Scotland. Celtic missionaries, operating out of centres like Iona and Lindisfarne, brought a more ascetic and decentralised form of the faith. Their approach was more grassroots, focusing on personal devotion and the conversion of individuals. This dual-pronged conversion process created a unique situation in England, with 2 competing forms of Christianity coexisting and occasionally clashing. This tension came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, a key ecclesiastical meeting called by King Oswiu of Northumbria. At the Synod, the 2 Christian traditions debated their practices, particularly the method for calculating the date of Easter. The Roman side, represented by Wilfrid, argued for conformity with the broader Catholic Church, while the Celtic side defended its local traditions. The ultimate decision in favour of the Roman practice was a pivotal moment. It aligned the English Church with the papacy in Rome, integrating it into the mainstream of European Christendom, and paving the way for a more unified English identity. The Synod's outcome provided a crucial ideological and administrative framework that would support the later political unification of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The late 8th century marked a new and brutal phase in England's history with the arrival of Scandinavian raiders. The first documented attack occurred in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne, an isolated and wealthy centre of learning on the Northumbrian coast. This event, shocking in its sacrilege, signaled the beginning of a relentless period of maritime incursions. The Vikings, as they came to be known, were expert seafarers, their swift, shallow-draft longships allowing them to strike with little warning far inland along rivers. This tactical advantage, combined with a warrior culture that valued plunder and combat, made them a formidable force against the fragmented Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, who were accustomed to more conventional land-based warfare. For decades, these raids were seasonal, with Viking forces returning to Scandinavia after plundering coastal targets. However, from the mid-9th century onward, a new strategy emerged. The Vikings began overwintering in England, establishing fortified encampments from which they could launch sustained campaigns. This shift transformed the nature of the conflict from mere raiding to territorial conquest. In 865 AD, a massive force, known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This was not an army of raiders but of settlers, seeking to establish a permanent presence. They systematically conquered the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, and much of Mercia, dismantling existing political structures and replacing them with Scandinavian rule. The Great Army's conquests led to the establishment of the Danelaw, a vast region in northeastern England where Danish law and custom prevailed. Archaeological finds in this area provide clear evidence of this settlement. From Scandinavian-style artifacts and burial customs to the widespread adoption of Danish place names, particularly in the shires of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, the imposition of the Danelaw fundamentally altered the cultural and legal geography of England, creating a distinct Anglo-Scandinavian society. It represented a direct challenge to Anglo-Saxon political authority and set the stage for a long and desperate struggle for the very survival of the English kingdoms. Following the relentless campaigns of the Great Heathen Army, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced an existential threat. It was in this context that Alfred, who ascended to the throne of Wessex in 871 AD, began his struggle for survival. His early reign was marked by military setbacks, culminating in his famous retreat to the marshes of Athelney in 878. From this isolated stronghold, Alfred regrouped his forces and, with the support of local militias, launched a counter-offensive. The decisive victory at the Battle of Edington in the same year was a pivotal moment. It compelled the Viking leader Guthrum to sue for peace, leading to the Treaty of Wedmore. This agreement partitioned England, formally recognising the Danelaw while securing the independence of Wessex. Alfred's subsequent strategy was a radical departure from his predecessor's defensive failures. He initiated the construction of a network of fortified settlements known as burhs. These fortified towns were strategically located to protect trade routes and provide secure refuges for the population. They were built on a standardized plan, with earthworks and timber walls, and their garrisons were manned by a system of conscription that ensured their constant readiness. The burhs proved highly effective in deterring Viking attacks and served as administrative and commercial centres, laying the groundwork for a more robust national infrastructure. Beyond his military achievements, Alfred is credited with laying the intellectual and legal foundations for a unified England. He oversaw a programme of educational reform, lamenting the decline of Latin literacy among the clergy and initiating the translation of key texts from Latin into Old English. This effort, documented in his preface to Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, sought to make knowledge accessible to a wider audience. He also compiled a new code of law, the Doom Book, which synthesized existing laws from Wessex, Mercia, and Kent. This legal compilation, grounded in biblical and Germanic traditions, provided a common judicial framework for a kingdom that was expanding its authority beyond its traditional borders. Alfred's reign transformed a beleaguered kingdom into a confident and unified polity, initiating a process of consolidation that would be continued by his successors and culminate in a single English nation. Alfred's death in 899 AD did not end the struggle for English unification, but rather accelerated it. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, became the architects of a strategic and systematic reconquest of the Danelaw. Their military campaigns, documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, were not random assaults, but a coordinated effort to dismantle Viking power. Edward advanced from the south, building on his father's Burr network, constructing new fortifications to secure each captured territory. Concurrently, Ethelflad, a formidable military leader in her own right, expanded Mercian control from the west, leading her forces to recapture key Danish strongholds like Derby and Leicester. This pincer movement methodically squeezed the Vikings out of the Midlands, forcing them to submit or flee. The death of Æthelflæd in 918 AD left the last vestiges of Mercian independence to her brother, Edward, who swiftly annexed the kingdom, bringing the entire region south of the Humber under the direct control of Wessex. The political entity that emerged was a single, powerful kingdom, no longer just Wessex, but an ascendant England. Edward's son and successor, Athelstan, consolidated this achievement and extended English authority further than any ruler before him. Athelstan's coronation in 925 AD marked the first time a single king ruled all of England. His military successes were equally significant. He faced a formidable coalition of Viking, Scottish, and Strathclyde Briton forces who sought to halt the expansion of English power. The climactic conflict came at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD. Though its exact location is debated, the battle was a decisive English victory. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the fighting in epic terms, recording the death of 5 kings and 7 of Anlaf's earls, effectively shattering the alliance against him. Athelstan's triumph at Brunanburh solidified his reputation as a warrior king and secured the borders of his newly unified realm. His political acumen was as sharp as his sword. He cultivated diplomatic relationships with continental rulers, marrying his sisters to princes and kings across Europe, which gave his reign a prestige unmatched by his predecessors. He was a king who styled himself not just as the ruler of England, but as Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, a title reflecting a new and ambitious political reality forged by the House of Wessex. Following the death of Edgar the Peaceful, the English monarchy entered a period of instability that would undo much of the previous century's work. The reign of Aethelred II, a king whose nickname Unrad meant ill-advised, was characterized by political division and a catastrophic failure to contain renewed Viking incursions. Beginning in the 982s, Danish and Norwegian fleets, now well organized under powerful chieftains, began to raid England on a scale not seen since the Great Heathen Army. The Anglo-Saxon defence, weakened by a lack of a unified command and a series of poor strategic decisions, proved largely ineffectual against these new threats. Instead of confronting the Vikings directly in open battle, Aethelred's government repeatedly resorted to a policy of appeasement. The central feature of this disastrous policy was the Danegeld, a system of tribute payments intended to bribe the Viking armies into leaving. The first significant payment of 1,000 pounds of silver was made in 991, but this only encouraged further, larger demands. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records several such payments, with the amount escalating dramatically over time. By 1012, the tribute had reached 4,800 pounds, a sum that drained the English treasury and impoverished the population. This financial burden, coupled with the humiliation of paying off foreign invaders, eroded public trust in the monarchy and created widespread discontent. The Danegeld was a short-term solution that created long-term problems, as it provided the Vikings with the resources to fund their next invasion. Ethelred's military failures were compounded by his political blunders. In 1002, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, an act of brutal xenophobia that backfired spectacularly. Among the victims was the sister of Svein Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. This act of violence provided Svein with a personal vendetta and a legitimate casus belli for a full-scale invasion. Over the next decade, Svein launched a series of devastating campaigns that systematically broke down English resistance. The English defence, hampered by betrayals and internal feuds among the nobility, was incapable of mounting a coordinated response. The kingdom's military and political structures, once the envy of Europe, were now so compromised that they could not protect the population. By 1013, Svein had been proclaimed King of England, and Aethelred fled to Normandy, his kingdom lost and his reign a complete failure. Following Svein Forkbeard's conquest and his subsequent death in 1014, the struggle for the English throne continued between his son, Cnut, and Aethelred's heir, Edmund Ironside. This conflict was a test of military endurance, with each side gaining and losing ground in a series of campaigns across the country. The decisive moment came in 1016 at the Battle of Assendon, a bloody engagement that saw Edmund's forces decisively defeated. The outcome led to a negotiated settlement that partitioned the kingdom between the two rivals, but Edmund's death just a few weeks later left Cnut as the sole ruler of England. His accession marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the beginning of a brief but consequential period of Danish dominance. Cnut's rule, however, was not characterized by the brutal tyranny his father had employed. He understood that a conquered kingdom could not be governed by force alone. His primary goal was to secure and legitimize his authority, and he pursued this with remarkable political acumen. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Aethelred II, a strategic union that both neutralized the threat from the exiled Anglo-Saxon royal family and forged an alliance with one of Europe's most powerful duchies. He also made a conscious effort to integrate his Danish and English subjects. He retained key Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative structures, including the shire system and the witan, a council of advisors. He also appointed Englishmen to positions of power, trusting them to govern on his behalf, and providing a sense of continuity. His administrative reforms, outlined in his law codes, sought to promote peace and stability. He enforced a strict legal code, punishing those who defied royal authority regardless of their ethnicity. He dismantled his own Viking army, sending most of his men back to Scandinavia and integrating the rest into a new royal bodyguard known as the Housecarls, a formidable force of professional soldiers paid with denegeld. This act was a profound symbol of his commitment to ruling as an English king. His pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 further enhanced his legitimacy on the international stage, demonstrating his piety and his status as a Christian ruler. Cnut forged a vast North Sea empire, uniting England, Denmark, and Norway under a single crown. England, once a victim of Viking raids, was now the wealthy and powerful centre of a new political and economic union. This brief but impactful period of foreign rule demonstrated England's strategic importance and its resilience in adapting to new forms of governance. The death of Cnut the Great in 1035 plunged England into a new period of political instability. After a brief and contested succession, the crown returned to the Anglo-Saxon line in 1042 with the accession of Edward, son of Aethelred II. Edward, later known as the Confessor for his piety, was raised in exile in Normandy, and this upbringing profoundly shaped his reign. He lacked the personal and military authority of his Danish predecessors, and his time on the throne was marked less by war and more by the intricate power struggles of the English nobility. His piety was a defining characteristic of his rule. He preferred the quiet of religious contemplation to the rigors of governance, and his detachment created a power vacuum that ambitious earls were quick to exploit. The most powerful of these magnates was Earl Godwin of Wessex, whose family controlled immense wealth and military resources. Godwin's children held key earldoms across the country, and his daughter, Edith, was married to the king, a union that cemented the family's influence. However, Edward's ties to Normandy created a rival faction. He appointed Norman favourites to high positions within the church and state, including Robert of Jumièges as Archbishop of Canterbury. These appointments caused deep resentment among the English nobility, who viewed the Normans as foreign usurpers. The tension between the Anglo-Saxon and Norman factions came to a head in 1051, when Godwin and his sons were exiled. Edward, seizing the opportunity, brought in more Norman advisors and soldiers. strengthening his connection to the duchy across the Channel. The most critical political issue of Edward's reign was the succession. His marriage to Edith was childless, leaving no direct heir to the throne. This created a profound uncertainty that became a central point of political manoeuvring. The key claimants to the throne included Harold Godwinson, son of the powerful Earl Godwin, and William, Duke of Normandy. The Norman claim was bolstered by the alleged promises Edward had made during his exile and visits from Norman ambassadors. The Godwins, however, represented the dominant force in English politics and military power, and Harold, after his family's return from exile, was positioned as the most likely English candidate. The political stage was set for a succession crisis. When Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, he left no clear instructions, and England was thrown into a struggle for the throne that would define the course of its history. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 precipitated a three-way struggle for the English throne, a conflict that would be resolved in a single pivotal year. The Witan, a council of English nobles and clergy, immediately chose Harold Godwinson, the most powerful magnate in the kingdom, to succeed Edward. Harold's claim was based on his political strength and Edward's deathbed appointment, and his coronation was swift. His position, however, was immediately challenged by two other formidable claimants: Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, and William, Duke of Normandy. Hardrada's claim was based on a pact between his predecessor and the Danish king Harthacnut, who had briefly ruled England. William's was more complex, resting on a distant blood relationship to Edward and an alleged promise from the late king, with his claim bolstered by a sworn oath from Harold himself, a vow made during a visit to Normandy several years earlier. The year was defined by a series of forced marches and battles of unparalleled intensity. In September, Hardrada, with the support of Harold's estranged brother Tostig Godwinson, invaded northern England. His army seized York after defeating the local English levies at the Battle of Fulford. Harold Godwinson, having anticipated an invasion from the south, was forced to march his army over 180 miles in just a few days to confront the Norwegian threat. On September 25, his army surprised Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a decisive engagement in which both Hardrada and Tostig were killed. Harold's victory was a testament to his military leadership and the discipline of his forces, but it came at a significant cost in terms of manpower and exhaustion. Just days later, on September 28, Duke William's invasion force landed unopposed at Pevensey on the southern coast. William had spent months preparing his fleet and a combined army of Norman knights and mercenaries from across France. The news of William's landing forced Harold to march his army back south, covering the same ground in reverse, a grueling journey that left his forces depleted. The two armies met on October 14 near Hastings. The Battle of Hastings was a clash of military styles. The English, fighting on foot in a tight-knit shield wall, repelled repeated Norman cavalry charges. William's forces, however, utilized a combination of feigned retreats and archers to break the English formations. The battle culminated with the death of Harold Godwinson, likely from an arrow wound to the eye, an event that shattered English morale. With their king dead and their army scattered, the Anglo-Saxon resistance quickly collapsed. William marched on London, and by Christmas Day he was crowned King of England, forever ending the Anglo-Saxon line and ushering in a new era of Norman rule. Following his victory at Hastings, William's conquest was far from complete. He faced a series of fragmented but determined rebellions across the kingdom. The English resistance was led by Edgar Atheling, a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, and powerful earls in the north. William's response was a systematic and brutal campaign to crush all opposition and assert his authority. His most ruthless act was the harrying of the north between 1069 and 1070. To quell a rebellion in the north, he ordered the complete devastation of the region, burning villages, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock. The scorched earth policy resulted in widespread famine and mass starvation, effectively eliminating the capacity for future resistance. The campaign was a chilling demonstration of William's determination to brook no dissent. To secure his authority, William implemented a comprehensive feudal system. He declared all land in England to be his personal property, which he then granted to his Norman followers in exchange for military service and loyalty. This act of confiscation and redistribution fundamentally altered the English social structure. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was dispossessed, with their lands and titles given to William's most loyal knights and barons. The new Norman lords imposed a rigid hierarchy, with the king at the apex, followed by his tenants-in-chief, and then a series of lesser knights and vassals. This new system, based on military obligation, ensured that Norman power was cemented across every corner of the kingdom, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant. In 1085, to formalize and solidify his control, William commissioned a great survey of his new kingdom. The result was the Domesday Book. Teams of royal commissioners were dispatched to every village and shire to meticulously record every piece of land, its resources, its value, and its inhabitants. The survey documented who owned the land before the conquest and who owned it now, providing William with an unassailable record of his new holdings. The Domesday Book was more than just a fiscal document. It was a chillingly precise picture of a conquered nation. Its records revealed the complete subjugation of the English aristocracy, with the vast majority of land now held by Normans. This monumental administrative achievement provided a detailed blueprint for a new form of royal governance, one based on absolute power and meticulous record-keeping. The survey's name, derived from the Anglo-Saxon word for doom or judgment, reflected its finality and its comprehensive nature, a document from which there was no appeal. The accession of William II in 1087, following the death of his father William the Conqueror, marked the beginning of a reign defined by autocracy and conflict. William, known as Rufus for his ruddy complexion, lacked his father's strategic foresight and political acumen, ruling instead through a combination of ruthless will and personal ambition. His inheritance of the English throne, while his elder brother Robert Curthose received the Duchy of Normandy, created a divided inheritance that sowed seeds of perpetual conflict. Rufus spent much of his reign asserting his authority over rebellious Norman barons who held lands on both sides of the Channel and sought to unify the family's domains under a single ruler. His military campaigns were relentless, focusing on securing control of Normandy through force and political pressure. Rufus's most profound conflict was with the Church. He exhibited a profound lack of piety and viewed the ecclesiastical hierarchy as little more than a source of revenue. He systematically kept bishoprics and abbeys vacant after the deaths of their occupants, a practice that allowed him to seize their incomes and divert them into the royal treasury. This policy brought him into a direct and bitter confrontation with Anselm of Canterbury, a renowned scholar and a firm defender of clerical independence. The dispute over the right of investiture, the power to appoint bishops, escalated to the point that Anselm was forced into exile. The conflict left the English Church in a state of open opposition to the crown and solidified Rufus's reputation as a tyrannical monarch who prioritized temporal wealth over spiritual authority. To fund his extensive military campaigns and personal excesses, Rufus employed a number of rapacious financial policies. He exploited the feudal system to its fullest extent, demanding heavy payments from his vassals and imposing high taxes on his subjects. His financial ministers were notorious for their efficiency and avarice. His domestic policy was characterized by a disregard for the rights of his subjects and a willingness to break established laws for personal gain. His administration was, however, remarkably effective in its primary goal of revenue extraction, which allowed him to maintain a powerful military and a lavish court. The end of William Rufus's reign was as controversial as its beginning. On the 2nd of August 1100, he was killed by an arrow while on a hunting trip in the New Forest. The official account attributed the death to a stray arrow shot by his companion Walter Tyrrell. However, the circumstances have remained a source of historical debate due to the immediate and opportunistic succession of his younger brother Henry, who was also present on the hunt. Henry quickly rode to Winchester, where the royal treasury was kept, and had himself crowned king 3 days later, circumventing the claim of his elder brother Robert. The sudden death of the king, without a clear heir, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the event left a cloud of uncertainty over the succession and marked a dramatic end to a tumultuous reign. The sudden death of William Rufus on the 2nd of August 1100 presented a power vacuum that his younger brother Henry moved to fill with remarkable speed. While his elder brother, Robert Curthose, was still abroad on the First Crusade, Henry seized the royal treasury at Winchester and had himself crowned king at Westminster 3 days later. His first act as king was to issue a coronation charter, a document that promised to redress the tyrannical abuses of his brother's reign. It was a calculated political maneuver aimed at winning the support of the English nobility and the church, who had suffered greatly under Rufus. The charter promised to end the practice of keeping church lands vacant and to curb the rapacious financial policies that had defined his brother's rule. Henry's reign was a study in administrative reform and political consolidation. He sought to create a more efficient and stable form of governance, one that could manage a kingdom divided between two cultures. His most significant reform was the creation of the Exchequer. This central financial department, named after the checkered tablecloth used to calculate accounts, standardized the collection of royal revenues and provided a clear system of accountability. The Exchequer was a revolutionary administrative tool that allowed the king to systematically track the kingdom's finances, ensuring that taxes and feudal dues were collected with unprecedented efficiency. This rationalization of royal administration laid the groundwork for the modern state. In a move that profoundly symbolized his desire to unite the Norman and English factions, Henry married Edith of Scotland, a princess from the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. She was a great-niece of Edward the Confessor and a descendant of Alfred the Great. The marriage, while seen as a calculated political act by some Norman nobles, was immensely popular with the English population, who saw in the Queen a connection to their own heritage. The union provided Henry's children with a claim to the English throne through both Norman Conquest and Anglo-Saxon lineage, a powerful legitimacy that his predecessors had lacked. Their children were now heirs to a truly Anglo-Norman kingdom. Henry spent the early part of his reign securing his rule against a series of challenges from his brother, Robert Curthose. The conflict culminated at the Battle of Tinchebray in Normandy in 1106, where Henry decisively defeated and captured Robert. He imprisoned his brother for the remainder of his life, a long incarceration that effectively ended any further threat to his reign. The victory at Tinchebray also allowed Henry to reunify England and Normandy under a single ruler, a position of unprecedented power that had been held only by his father. By the end of his reign, Henry had created a stable and prosperous kingdom, but his death without a male heir would plunge England into a period of prolonged civil war. Henry I's death in 1135, without a surviving legitimate male heir, created a profound succession crisis. Despite having compelled his barons to swear allegiance to his daughter, Matilda, the English nobility were reluctant to accept a female ruler. Within weeks of Henry's death, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, a popular and charismatic figure, crossed the Channel from Boulogne and seized the throne. His quick action, combined with his acclaim from the London citizenry and support from his brother Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, allowed him to secure the crown. Matilda, meanwhile, was in Anjou, and her initial claim was undermined by her physical absence and her husband's unpopularity with the Norman magnates. The political facade of Stephen's reign began to crumble in 1138, when Matilda's half-brother, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, renounced his allegiance to Stephen. This action ignited a civil war that would last for nearly 2 decades and become known as the Anarchy. The conflict was not a single, continuous war, but a series of fragmented local conflicts. Barons with private armies seized the opportunity to fortify their lands without royal permission, constructing hundreds of illegal castles to consolidate their power. The royal authority, which had been so carefully built by Henry I, dissolved into a patchwork of competing loyalties. The chronicler who wrote the Gesta Stephani described the period with profound despair, noting that Christ and his saints slept. The war reached its peak in 1141. Following Stephen's defeat and capture at the Battle of Lincoln, Matilda was proclaimed Lady of the English at Winchester. However, her triumph was short-lived. Her arrogant and high-handed treatment of the London citizens and her failure to secure their support led to a revolt. She was forced to flee the city, and later that year, her forces were defeated, and her chief supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was captured in an exchange that led to Stephen's release. The war settled into a long and bloody stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The breakdown of central authority led to a period of widespread lawlessness. The illegal castles became bases for rogue lords who extorted money and resources from their tenants and raided the lands of their rivals. Trade was disrupted, agriculture suffered, and the general population endured great hardship. The violence and disorder were not just a result of the war, but a symptom of the monarchy's impotence. The conflict only began to draw to a close when Matilda's son, Henry, a formidable and ambitious young man, launched his own invasion of England. With Stephen's hold on power tenuous and his own heir dead, a negotiated settlement was finally reached. The Treaty of Winchester of 1153 formally ended the conflict, recognizing Stephen as king for life, but designating Henry as his successor, paving the way for the rise of a new dynasty. The death of Stephen in 1154 and the accession of Henry II to the English throne marked the end of the Civil War and the beginning of a new dynasty. As the son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, Henry inherited a vast and powerful collection of territories that stretched across France, a domain far larger than that of the King of France himself. This vast empire, known as the Angevin Empire, encompassed the Duchy of Normandy, the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, and, following his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, the Duchy of Aquitaine. The Angevin lands gave Henry unprecedented wealth and military power, fundamentally altering the balance of power in Western Europe and placing the English monarch in a position of dominance. Upon his accession, Henry's primary goal was to restore the royal authority that had been eroded during the anarchy. He immediately set about dismantling the hundreds of illegal castles that had been built by barons during the Civil War, a decisive action that reasserted the crown's military and political supremacy. He also moved to centralize the kingdom's governance, relying on a small circle of trusted and talented administrators. He revived the Exchequer, the financial institution established by his grandfather Henry I, and made it the centerpiece of his administration, ensuring that the crown's revenues were collected with efficiency. This administrative revival restored the king's financial power and provided the resources needed for his military campaigns and legal reforms. Henry's most enduring legacy was his profound transformation of the English legal system. He sought to create a uniform and accessible system of justice that applied to all free men throughout the kingdom, a system that would come to be known as the common law. Previously, local justice was administered through a patchwork of manorial, county, and ecclesiastical courts, with disparate customs and procedures. Henry established a system of itinerant royal justices who travelled the country, hearing cases and applying a consistent body of law. He introduced the use of the jury to determine guilt or innocence in both criminal and civil cases, a revolutionary concept that replaced the medieval practice of trial by ordeal. The Assize of Clarendon of 1166, for example, formalized the procedures for jury presentment and established a system of royal courts that would eventually supersede all others. The establishment of the common law provided stability and a sense of order after the chaos of the anarchy. It provided a powerful tool for the king to consolidate his authority and to administer justice throughout his realm, a goal that his predecessors had struggled to achieve. The legal innovations of Henry II's reign, including the distinction between criminal and civil law and the use of the jury, would become the bedrock of the English legal system for centuries to come, and would eventually be exported to other parts of the world. By the end of his reign, Henry had not only restored the power of the monarchy, but had also laid the foundations of a legal and administrative state. The conflict between Henry II and his former Chancellor, Thomas Becket, stemmed from a fundamental disagreement over the jurisdiction of royal and ecclesiastical courts. Following his legal reforms, Henry sought to bring all citizens, including the clergy, under the authority of the common law. He aimed to limit the power of the Church, which at the time operated as a parallel jurisdiction with its own laws, courts, and immunities. Clerics accused of crimes were tried in ecclesiastical courts, which could not impose the death penalty, a practice that Henry saw as a direct challenge to his royal authority and a threat to public order. Henry believed that an effective legal system required all subjects to be answerable to a single set of laws, with the king as the ultimate arbiter. In 1162, Henry appointed Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury, believing his close friend and loyal chancellor would support these reforms. The appointment was a profound miscalculation. Becket, once a worldly and extravagant figure, underwent a dramatic transformation upon becoming archbishop. He embraced a life of rigorous piety and asceticism, and in doing so, became a zealous defender of the Church's independence and its traditional rights. He staunchly opposed Henry's reforms, particularly the king's insistence that clerics who had been defrocked by ecclesiastical courts should then be handed over to royal courts for punishment. This issue of criminous clerks became the central point of contention between the two men. The climax of their conflict came with the Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164. This document, a series of 16 articles, formalized the customs and rights that Henry claimed for the crown. It stipulated that all clerics accused of felonies must be tried in royal courts, and that appeals from ecclesiastical courts could not be made to Rome without the king's consent. Becket initially agreed to the constitutions but later repudiated them, plunging the relationship with the king into open hostility. He fled England to seek refuge on the continent, a self-imposed exile that would last for 6 years. During his exile, he excommunicated a number of bishops and royal officials who had supported the king, further escalating the crisis. Becket's eventual return to England in 1170 was short-lived and fraught with tension. Despite a public reconciliation with Henry, the underlying issues remained unresolved. Becket's continued defiance and his excommunication of bishops who had sided with the king led to a moment of intense frustration for Henry. The king, in a fit of rage, is famously said to have cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights took his words literally. They travelled to Canterbury and, on the 29th of December 1170, murdered Becket in his own cathedral. The murder was a shocking and sacrilegious act that sent shockwaves across Europe. Becket was immediately revered as a martyr, and Henry was forced to make a public show of penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury and allowing himself to be whipped by monks at Becket's tomb. The murder, while silencing Becket, ultimately undermined Henry's cause. The king was forced to abandon his most radical legal reforms, and the Church successfully maintained its independent legal status for centuries to come. The accession of Richard I in 1189 marked a shift in the English monarchy's focus from domestic administration to international crusading. His reign, lasting 10 years, saw him spend a total of only 6 months in England. Richard was an accomplished military commander, a reputation he had earned through his rebellious campaigns against his father, Henry II, and his masterful suppression of a rebellion in Aquitaine. His primary ambition was to participate in the Third Crusade, a holy war aimed at recapturing Jerusalem from Saladin. To fund this enormous undertaking, Richard taxed his English kingdom heavily, selling offices and titles, and even offering to release the Scottish king from feudal obligations for a large sum of money. The kingdom was an immense source of revenue for his foreign ambitions. Richard's journey to the Holy Land was characterized by a series of strategic maneuvers and military conquests. He assembled a vast fleet in England and sailed to Sicily, where he spent a winter negotiating a treaty before proceeding to Cyprus. He conquered the island in 1191, a move that was as much about logistics as it was about territorial expansion, as Cyprus provided a vital supply base for the crusading forces. His arrival in the Holy Land was a much-needed boost to the morale of the Crusaders, who had been locked in a protracted siege of the city of Acre. Richard's most celebrated military triumph came at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191. Leading the crusading army, he decisively defeated Saladin's forces in a pitched battle that was a masterpiece of military discipline and tactical control. The victory secured the coastal cities for the Crusaders and demonstrated the superiority of a well-organized combined arms force over the more fluid, irregular cavalry of the Saracens. Following this, Richard entered negotiations with Saladin, ultimately failing to secure the capture of Jerusalem but succeeding in negotiating a 3-year truce that allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. Richard's return journey proved to be as eventful as his crusade. He was captured in Austria by Duke Leopold V, an act of revenge for a previous slight, and was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. His ransom was set at an unprecedented 1,500,000 marks, a sum that impoverished the English kingdom and required enormous taxes to be levied. The administration of England during Richard's long absence fell to his regents and officials, including his brother John, whose treachery and attempts to seize the throne were a constant source of anxiety. While his military exploits and crusading zeal cemented his heroic reputation, his long absences and heavy financial demands on his kingdom created an enduring legacy of a king who was both a legendary warrior and a largely absent ruler. The accession of King John in 1199 marked the beginning of a period of profound political instability and royal misrule. Unlike his older brother Richard, John lacked the military prowess and charisma to command the respect of his nobles, and his reign was characterized by a series of costly political and military failures. His most significant and immediate challenge was the defense of the Angevin territories in France. By 1204, following a series of military blunders and the political defection of his French allies, he had lost control of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. This catastrophic loss of ancestral lands not only diminished the power and prestige of the English crown, but also forced the Anglo-Norman nobility to choose between their English and French allegiances. To fund his military campaigns and to recoup the losses from his failed wars, John resorted to a systematic and tyrannical exploitation of his subjects. He imposed exorbitant and arbitrary taxes, often without the consent of his nobles, and he sold royal offices and honours to the highest bidder. He manipulated feudal customs to his advantage, demanding excessive fees for inheritance and wardship, and he levied a tax known as the scutage, a payment from knights in lieu of military service, with an unprecedented frequency. John's financial demands were relentless and deeply resented by a baronage that had grown accustomed to the more lenient policies of his predecessors. John's relationship with the church was equally strained. Following a dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John was excommunicated in 1209, and England was placed under an interdict. This meant that the sacraments could not be performed, a severe punishment that isolated the English kingdom from the rest of Catholic Europe and eroded the king's spiritual authority. John seized church lands and assets in retaliation, further alienating the clergy and provoking a crisis that would not be resolved until he submitted to the Pope's authority in 1213, agreeing to hold England as a papal fief. The culmination of John's misrule was the rebellion of the English barons. Tired of his arbitrary rule, financial exploitation, and military failures, they united in opposition to the king. In 1215, they presented him with a list of demands known as the Articles of the Barons, which sought to limit the king's power and to secure their own traditional rights and privileges. Surrounded by a rebel army at Runnymede, John had no choice but to negotiate. On the 15th of June 1215, he reluctantly affixed his seal to the Magna Carta, a document that formally recognized the rights of his subjects, established principles of due process, and asserted that even the king was subject to the rule of law. While the document was initially a product of baronial self-interest, its core principles would become the foundation of constitutional law and a powerful symbol of freedom for centuries to come. The accession of Henry III in 1216, at the age of 9, began one of the longest and most tumultuous reigns in English history. His rule, lasting 56 years, was characterized by a fundamental tension between his personal piety and his political incompetence. Early in his reign, a regency council managed affairs, reissuing the Magna Carta and quelling the rebellion that had been sparked by his father, King John. However, once Henry took personal control in 1227, his policies proved to be a constant source of friction with his nobles. He was a devout and cultured man who commissioned grand architectural projects, most notably the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. Yet, his political judgment was consistently poor. He surrounded himself with a coterie of unpopular foreign advisors and favourites, and his costly and ultimately failed military campaigns in France drained the royal treasury and alienated the baronage. The discontent with Henry's rule began to coalesce under the leadership of his brother-in-law Simon de Montfort, a formidable military commander and charismatic politician. De Montfort and a group of like-minded barons were tired of the king's arbitrary rule, his reckless spending, and his blatant disregard for the principles of the Magna Carta. In 1258, a council of nobles, armed and prepared for conflict, confronted Henry at Oxford. They presented him with the Provisions of Oxford, a radical document that sought to effectively end the king's absolute authority. It established a baronial council of 15 to govern alongside the king, with key ministers and officials to be appointed by this council rather than by Henry alone. The document was a direct challenge to the medieval concept of monarchical sovereignty and a pivotal step toward a more limited constitutional monarchy. Henry's initial acceptance of the provisions was short-lived. Over the next 5 years, he and the barons engaged in a complex political dance, with both sides seeking to undermine the other's authority. The conflict erupted into open warfare in 1264, a civil conflict known as the Barons' War. De Montfort proved to be an exceptional military leader. At the Battle of Lewes in 1264, he decisively defeated the royal army and captured both Henry III and his heir, Prince Edward. Following this victory, de Montfort became the de facto ruler of England. He governed with a broad-based council and in 1265 took the unprecedented step of summoning representatives from towns and boroughs to sit alongside the nobles and clergy. This assembly, often referred to as the first parliament in English history, was a revolutionary concept that expanded political representation beyond the traditional feudal elite. However, de Montfort's triumph was brief. His increasingly autocratic rule and his favoritism toward his own family alienated many of his former allies. In 1265, Prince Edward escaped from captivity and rallied the royalist forces. At the Battle of Evesham, Edward's army decisively defeated de Montfort's, and the rebel leader was killed in battle. His body was mutilated, a sign of the brutal ferocity of the Civil War. The king was restored to full power, but the Barons' War had a lasting legacy. While de Montfort's experiment in constitutional government was short-lived, the idea of a king ruling with the consent of his nobles and the precedent of parliamentary representation would prove to be a powerful and enduring force in English political development for centuries to come. The accession of Edward I in 1272 marked a new phase of royal ambition focused on consolidating English authority across the British Isles. Edward was a seasoned campaigner, having fought in the Barons' War, and his strategic vision extended beyond the borders of his kingdom. His most significant undertaking was the conquest of Wales, a process he approached with a methodical and brutal determination. For centuries, the Welsh princes of Gwynedd had maintained their independence, often through a combination of diplomatic maneuvering and fierce military resistance. Edward viewed this as an intolerable challenge to his sovereignty, and he was determined to bring the entire region under the direct control of the English crown. The campaign began in 1277 with a massive invasion force that systematically overwhelmed the Welsh. Edward's strategy was not simply to defeat the Welsh in battle, but to break their will to resist. He used a scorched earth policy, destroying crops and settlements to starve the population into submission. His military tactics were a blend of overwhelming force and sophisticated logistics, ensuring that his armies were well supplied and could maintain a presence in the difficult Welsh terrain. Following the initial conquest, Edward imposed the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284, which formally annexed Wales to the English crown and introduced English administrative and legal systems. To cement his authority and prevent future rebellions, Edward initiated an unprecedented castle-building program. He commissioned a ring of formidable stone fortresses designed by the master military architect James of St. George, which were unparalleled in their scale and defensive capabilities. Castles like Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris were constructed with concentric walls, multiple towers, and elaborate gatehouses. These fortresses were not merely military strongholds, but were also administrative centres and symbols of English dominance, housing garrisons and royal officials. The construction of these castles was an enormous and costly undertaking, draining the English treasury and requiring thousands of labourers. A subsequent Welsh rebellion in 1294, led by Madog ap Llywelyn, provided Edward with a final pretext to complete the subjugation of Wales. This time, his response was even more severe, resulting in the permanent dismantling of Welsh political structures and the installation of English administrators. Edward's long-term legacy in Wales was profound. He succeeded in bringing the region under English control, but his brutal methods and the imposition of a foreign culture left a deep and lasting legacy of resentment. His actions, while securing his rule, created a political reality that would define the relationship between England and Wales for centuries to come. The accession of Edward II in 1307 marked a precipitous decline in English royal authority and military fortunes. Unlike his imposing father, Edward I, the new king was more interested in personal pursuits than in the demanding duties of governance. His reign was immediately characterized by his disastrous favoritism toward his male companions, most notably Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight with whom he shared an exceptionally close bond. Edward's extravagant gifts and honours to Gaveston, and the latter's open disdain for the English nobility, ignited a fierce political struggle. The barons, led by Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, repeatedly demanded Gaveston's banishment. The conflict escalated into civil strife, culminating in the illegal execution of Gaveston by the barons in 1312, an act that deeply embittered the king and fractured the kingdom. While Edward was embroiled in these internal conflicts, the Scottish leader Robert the Bruce was systematically undoing the military gains of Edward I. Since the death of his rival John Comyn in 1306, Bruce had embarked on a highly effective guerrilla campaign against the English garrisons in Scotland. His strategy was not to confront the English in open battle, but to capture castles and fortifications one by one, a methodical process that gradually eroded English control. By 1313, Bruce had reclaimed most of Scotland, with only a few key strongholds remaining in English hands. The most prominent of these was Stirling Castle, which was under siege by Bruce's forces. The commander of the garrison, facing starvation, agreed to surrender if a relief force did not arrive by the 24th of June 1314. This gave Edward II a clear and inescapable challenge. Edward II responded by amassing a massive army, arguably the largest to ever leave England for Scotland. It included a formidable contingent of mounted knights and foot soldiers, along with Welsh archers. The king's goal was not merely to relieve Stirling, but to decisively crush the Scottish rebellion and reassert English dominance. The two armies met at the Battle of Bannockburn on June 23 and 24, 1314. The Scottish forces, significantly outnumbered, were strategically positioned in a forested area flanked by the Bannockburn stream, a tactic that negated the English cavalry's numerical advantage. Bruce's men dug a series of concealed pits, known as pots, to impede the English charge. The battle itself was a catastrophic military disaster for England. The English cavalry, unable to maneuver in the constrained terrain, fell into the prepared pits, disrupting their formations and leaving them vulnerable to Scottish spearmen. The Scottish schiltrons' dense formations of spearmen held firm against the English charge, and a surprise attack by a Scottish reserve force shattered the English morale. Edward II fled the battlefield, and his army was routed, suffering staggering casualties. The defeat at Bannockburn was a national humiliation that secured Scottish independence for nearly 4 centuries and discredited Edward's military leadership in the eyes of his nobles. This military catastrophe, coupled with his ongoing political failures, set the stage for the final, tragic years of his reign. The catastrophic pandemic known as the Black Death reached the shores of England in the summer of 1348, carried by fleas on black rats aboard merchant ships from mainland Europe. Its arrival in the port of Melcombe Regis initiated a devastating demographic collapse that swept across the island with brutal efficiency. The plague followed established trade routes and human migration patterns, moving from the southern coastal towns to the densely populated cities and rural communities of the north. The medical knowledge of the period was utterly ineffective against the disease, and contemporaries were bewildered by its rapid spread and horrifying symptoms. Within a matter of months, the mortality rates soared to unprecedented levels, with modern estimates suggesting that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire English population perished in just 2 years. The sheer scale of death profoundly altered the fabric of society. The immediate economic consequence of this demographic disaster was a severe and sudden labour shortage. The feudal system, which had long been based on the abundance of peasant labour tied to the land, was thrown into disarray. The surviving peasantry, now a scarce and valuable resource, found themselves in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. They could demand higher wages for their work in the fields, and many left their manors in search of lords willing to offer better terms, including freedom from traditional labour services. This newfound mobility and economic leverage began to unravel the manorial system, a social order that had defined English life for centuries. In an attempt to stabilise the economy and reassert their authority, the landholding elite responded with legislation. The Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, was a direct attempt to combat the economic shifts brought on by the plague. The law mandated that wages for labourers and craftsmen be fixed at pre-plague levels and prohibited peasants from leaving their manors in pursuit of better pay. It was a clear effort by the propertied class to maintain a social hierarchy that the plague had fundamentally disrupted. The statute, however, proved largely unenforceable. The economic reality of a labour market turned on its head was a far more powerful force than royal decree. The long-term effects of the plague were a direct acceleration of social change. Despite the legal restrictions, peasants continued to demand and receive higher wages. Over time, lords were compelled to commute traditional labour services for cash rents, a process that gave tenants greater personal freedom and autonomy. This shift from obligatory service to tenancy marked a significant step in the decline of serfdom. The massive mortality rate created a new social and economic reality, where the value of a labourer was greater than ever before. This demographic catastrophe, more than any political or military event, was the engine of a social transformation that would reshape English society for generations. The reign of Edward III, commencing in 1327, initiated a period of military resurgence for the English monarchy, pivoting the kingdom from internal disarray to international conflict. The primary catalyst was a complex dynastic claim to the French throne through his mother, Isabella, the daughter of the French king Philip IV. Following the death of Philip's sons without male heirs, the French nobility invoked Salic law to exclude Isabella and her son from the line of succession, installing Philip VI as the new monarch. Edward's assertion of his claim in 1337, a direct challenge to French legitimacy, marked the formal beginning of the 100 Years' War, a protracted struggle that would define the political landscape of both kingdoms for generations. The initial phase of the conflict saw significant English military innovations. While early land campaigns were inconclusive, the English navy secured a pivotal victory at the Battle of Sluys in 1340. This decisive naval engagement fought in the harbour of Sluys, saw the English fleet, led by Edward III himself, systematically destroy the French navy. The outcome gave England control of the Channel, securing vital supply lines and preventing a French invasion, a strategic advantage that would be maintained throughout the war's early decades. The conflict's focus shifted to land with Edward's chevauchée, a large-scale mounted raid, through Normandy in 1346. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Crécy, a foundational engagement that demonstrated a new military reality. The English forces, significantly outnumbered, adopted a defensive position on a ridge. Their army was organised with dismounted knights flanked by large contingents of Welsh and English longbowmen. The French, relying on the traditional feudal charge of their heavily armoured cavalry, advanced chaotically. The longbowmen, firing at a rapid rate, unleashed a storm of arrows that proved devastatingly effective against the French formations. The battle was a rout, resulting in staggering French casualties and a profound loss of prestige for the French chivalry. Following Crécy, Edward's army proceeded to besiege the port city of Calais. The prolonged siege of Calais lasted for 11 months, a testament to the English army's logistical capacity and a severe blow to French morale. Its eventual capture in 1347 provided England with a strategically vital foothold on the continent that would serve as a crucial military and commercial hub for 2 centuries. A decade later, in 1356, Edward's son, Edward, the Black Prince, led a similar campaign through France that culminated in the Battle of Poitiers. The English army, once again outnumbered, used a formation similar to Crécy, with dismounted knights and longbowmen in a defensive position. The French, led by King John II, launched a series of failed charges against the English lines. The longbowmen's volleys broke the French advance, and the English counterattack resulted in a total victory. The most significant outcome was the capture of King John II himself, a monumental political triumph that brought enormous prestige and a massive ransom to the English crown. These early victories under Edward III established a military dominance that would define the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The social tensions that had been simmering for decades in the wake of the Black Death reached a boiling point in the spring of 1381, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt. The immediate cause was the imposition of a deeply unpopular poll tax, the third of its kind since 1377. Unlike previous taxes, this one was levied on every person over the age of 15, regardless of wealth or status. The flat-rate tax was seen as a profound injustice, disproportionately burdening the rural peasantry and urban poor. Widespread resistance to its collection, particularly in Essex and Kent, provided the spark for a coordinated and violent uprising that would challenge the very foundations of the kingdom. The revolt began in late May in Essex, where a tax collector's attempt to enforce payment was met with open defiance. The unrest quickly spread across the southeast, with local rebels forming armed bands that moved to seize manorial records and judicial documents. Their targets were not only royal officials, but also the symbols of manorial oppression, including the homes of local lords and lawyers. The rebellion's leadership coalesced around figures such as Wat Tyler and the radical cleric John Bull, whose anti-establishment sermons had long been popular among the common people. By early June, the rebels had a clear set of grievances: an end to the poll tax, the abolition of serfdom, and a demand for a fixed rent for all land. On June 13, a large contingent of rebels, estimated to be in the tens of thousands, converged on London. They were met by King Richard II, a boy of only 14, at Mile End. The king, advised by his councillors, agreed to meet the rebels' demands for the abolition of serfdom and a general pardon. Many of the rebels, having received a royal charter, began to disperse. However, a more radical element remained, determined to secure further concessions and vengeance against the king's advisers. This faction, led by Wat Tyler, proceeded to burn down the Savoy Palace, the home of John of Gaunt, and execute the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon of Sudbury, and the Lord High Treasurer, Robert Hales, both of whom were seen as architects of the poll tax. The climax of the revolt occurred on June 15. when Richard II met with Wat Tyler at Smithfield. During the negotiations, a confrontation erupted, and Tyler was killed by the Lord Mayor of London. With their leader dead, the remaining rebels were thrown into disarray and were quickly suppressed by royal forces. In the aftermath, the promises made by the king at Mile End were rescinded. Richard II declared that serfdom would not be abolished, and that the charters of freedom were void. While the revolt was a short-term military failure for the rebels, it had a profound long-term impact. The ruling class was forced to acknowledge the deep-seated grievances of the peasantry, and the fear of future uprisings led to a gradual, though not immediate, end to serfdom in England. It was a clear demonstration that feudal authority could no longer be taken for granted. The reign of Richard II, beginning in 1377, was marked by a constant struggle to assert royal authority against a powerful and increasingly hostile nobility. Having ascended to the throne as a child, his early rule was managed by a regency council. The peasants' revolt of 1381, though suppressed, profoundly shaped his political worldview, convincing him that a firm autocratic hand was necessary to control his realm. As he matured, Richard's governance became increasingly personal and confrontational. He alienated the nobility by surrounding himself with a small circle of favoured companions, granting them titles and influence that bypassed the traditional aristocratic hierarchy. This favouritism led to a deep rift with the established magnates, who viewed his inner circle as a source of corruption and a threat to their traditional rights. The conflict escalated into a major political crisis in 1386 with the formation of the Lords Appellant. This group of powerful nobles, including his uncle Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, sought to remove the king's favourites and restore what they saw as proper governance. Their grievances were laid out in the merciless Parliament of 1388, which saw the appellants successfully prosecute and execute many of Richard's closest allies. Richard, stripped of his power, was forced to accept a council that effectively controlled the government, a humiliation that he would not forget. For the next decade, Richard appeared to govern with a new spirit of conciliation, rebuilding his authority with quiet caution. However, his actions were a carefully veiled strategy for revenge. In 1397, he struck suddenly and ruthlessly against the appellants. The Duke of Gloucester was arrested and died in custody, while others were either executed or exiled. This tyranny of the final years saw Richard seize lands, extract forced loans, and rule without the consent of Parliament, a clear abandonment of the principles established in the Magna Carta. His most consequential act was the exile of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke in 1398, a move that consolidated his authority but planted the seeds of his downfall. The final chapter of Richard's reign began with the death of Henry Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, in 1399. Richard II seized the vast Lancastrian estates, a move that was both illegal and politically reckless. It provided Henry with a legitimate grievance and a powerful incentive to return to England. Henry, landing in Yorkshire with a small force, quickly gathered support from a broad coalition of nobles and commoners who were fed up with Richard's arbitrary rule. Richard, who was in Ireland at the time, found his support in England had evaporated upon his return. Faced with an overwhelming opposition, he was forced to abdicate. In September 1399, Parliament formally deposed Richard II and proclaimed Henry Bolingbroke as King Henry IV, ending the Plantagenet line and ushering in the House of Lancaster. Richard's deposition demonstrated that a monarch who ignored the traditional power of the nobility and the will of his subjects could be removed, a lesson that would resonate throughout English history. The reign of Henry IV, beginning on the 30th of September 1399, was fundamentally defined by the circumstances of his usurpation. Having seized the throne from a legitimate, if tyrannical, monarch, Henry was keenly aware of his precarious position. His primary objective was to secure his hold on the crown and legitimize the new House of Lancaster. He did so by portraying himself as a restorer of traditional English governance, promising to rule with the consent of Parliament and the support of the nobility. His accession was formalised in Parliament, a deliberate act that set a precedent for parliamentary involvement in the succession and distinguished his claim from Richard's more autocratic style. Henry's reign was immediately challenged by a series of armed rebellions from nobles who either remained loyal to the deposed king or sought to take advantage of the political instability. The first major threat came from the Epiphany Rising in January 1400, a conspiracy by several of Richard II's former supporters to assassinate Henry and restore the captive monarch to the throne. The plot was swiftly discovered and brutally suppressed, resulting in the summary execution of its leaders. The ease with which this initial rebellion was crushed demonstrated Henry's capacity for decisive action and solidified his immediate control, but the threat of further instability remained. A far more protracted and serious challenge came from Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman who launched a major rebellion in 1400. Glyndwr's revolt, fueled by Welsh grievances against English rule and a resurgent Welsh nationalism, quickly gained widespread support. He was proclaimed Prince of Wales and launched a series of devastating raids on English towns along the border. The English response was slow and ineffectual, hindered by the difficult Welsh terrain and Henry's limited resources. The rebellion demonstrated the fragile nature of Henry's control and consumed a significant portion of his reign, forcing him to divert attention and funds from other matters to a costly and protracted war of attrition. The most dangerous rebellion came from the powerful Percy family of Northumberland in 1403. The Percys, who had been instrumental in Henry's rise to power, felt they had not been adequately rewarded for their loyalty. The rebellion, led by Henry Hotspur Percy and supported by the Scottish Earl of Douglas, aimed to overthrow Henry IV and install a new king. The climax of the revolt was the Battle of Shrewsbury in July 1403. It was a bloody and hard-fought engagement, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The death of Hotspur during the fighting broke the rebel forces, and the royal army secured a decisive victory. The battle effectively crushed the main threat to Henry's rule and proved his military competence, solidifying his claim to the throne through force of arms. Henry IV's efforts to establish a legitimate dynasty were a constant theme of his reign. He relied heavily on Parliament, summoning it frequently to seek support for his policies and, crucially, to secure the funds needed to fight his wars. This reliance on the nobility and the gentry through Parliament gave them an unprecedented level of influence in governance, a development that would have a lasting impact on the relationship between the monarch and the political class. His reign, though consumed by rebellions and financial strain, ultimately succeeded in transitioning the kingdom from the political instability of the late Plantagenet era to a more stable, albeit still contested, Lancastrian rule. The reign of Henry V, beginning in 1413, marked a dramatic shift from the political instability of his father's rule to a period of military glory and national unity. Henry, a formidable soldier and a shrewd politician, inherited a kingdom on the verge of civil war. His primary objective was to consolidate his authority and to secure his dynasty by reasserting the English claim to the French throne. This claim, which had been dormant for much of his father's reign due to domestic rebellions, was now to become the central focus of his policy. Henry's campaigns were meticulously planned and organized, drawing on lessons from the military failures of his predecessors. He secured parliamentary funding and relied on a more professional army of paid soldiers, rather than a feudal levy, a development that ensured greater discipline and loyalty. The invasion of France began in August 1415, with the siege of Harfleur, a crucial port city on the Norman coast. The capture of the city was a strategic necessity, as it would provide a secure landing point for future campaigns and a base for English operations in Normandy. The siege was a brutal and protracted affair, lasting over a month and costing the English a significant number of men due to disease and attrition. Despite the heavy losses, the city's surrender was a major victory and a clear demonstration of English resolve. With the siege concluded, Henry decided on a risky march across northern France to the English-held port of Calais. a move that would ultimately lead to his greatest triumph. The Battle of Agincourt, fought on the 25th of October 1415, was a military masterpiece that secured Henry's reputation and forever altered the course of the 100 Years' War. The English army, exhausted and outnumbered by a force of French nobility, was positioned in a narrow field bordered by woods, a terrain that negated the French advantage in heavy cavalry. Henry's tactical deployment relied heavily on his archers, who were armed with the powerful English longbow, a weapon capable of firing arrows with incredible speed and penetrating power. The French, confident in their numerical superiority, launched a series of charges that were decimated by a storm of arrows. The longbow's effectiveness was a decisive factor, breaking the cohesion of the French formations and turning a potential rout into a stunning victory for the English. In the aftermath of Agincourt, Henry V systematically conquered Normandy. He was not a reckless adventurer, but a methodical administrator, ensuring that each captured town and castle was garrisoned and governed effectively. His campaigns were marked by a clear strategic purpose: to secure a permanent English presence in France and to force the French to accept his claim to the throne. His victories, combined with the internal political chaos in France between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, allowed Henry to achieve his ultimate goal. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 declared Henry V regent of France and heir to the French throne, a stunning diplomatic coup that seemed to legitimize his conquests and unite the two kingdoms under a single crown. Henry V's death in 1422, at the height of his power, was a profound tragedy for the Lancastrian dynasty. He had secured the English throne, achieved military glory on an unprecedented scale, and seemingly won a foreign crown. His short but impactful reign had restored national pride and confidence, transforming his father's tenuous hold on power into a period of undisputed authority and martial success. His legacy was not just a series of military victories, but a new model of monarchy based on military competence and national consensus. The reign of Henry VI, beginning in 1422, was initiated under a regency, as he was less than a year old upon his father's death. The ambitious military and political gains of Henry V were placed in the hands of a council of nobles, most notably his uncles John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Bedford capably managed the war in France, but internal rivalries within the English government and the growing strategic overreach of the English position created an unsustainable situation. England's financial resources were strained by the need to maintain an army of occupation and garrison, a vast network of castles and towns across France, a burden that the kingdom's economy could not support indefinitely. The turning point in the war came with the appearance of Joan of Arc. Her leadership and tactical successes, particularly her role in the relief of the Siege of Orleans in 1429, revitalized the French national spirit and undermined the legitimacy of the English claim. The subsequent defeat of English forces at the Battle of Patay and the coronation of Charles VII at Reims transformed the conflict from a war of attrition into a struggle for French independence. The English position, which had seemed unassailable only a few years earlier, began to deteriorate rapidly. The Burgundian alliance, a key pillar of Henry V's success, fractured in 1435 with the Treaty of Arras, leaving England isolated and facing a unified French opposition. As Henry VI came of age, his personal character proved to be a liability. Unlike his martial father, Henry was profoundly pious, gentle, and averse to conflict. He showed little interest in military affairs or the cutthroat political maneuvering of his court. His lack of leadership allowed the powerful nobles to form factions around him, each vying for control of the government and the lucrative territories in France. The Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, and the Duke of Somerset, Edmund Beaufort, became the leading figures in the court, their bitter rivalry for political power often dictating military policy and contributing to the catastrophic failures of the English armies in France. The English armies were systematically driven from their French territories. Normandy, a possession held since the conquest, was entirely lost by 1450. The final defeat came at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, which saw the last remaining English stronghold in Gascony fall to the French. This battle marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War. England, which had begun the conflict as the dominant power, now held only the port of Calais on the European mainland. The military failures and the loss of a vast empire in France were a profound humiliation. The shock of these defeats, coupled with the ongoing political strife, triggered a mental and physical breakdown in the king. In 1453, Henry VI entered a state of catatonic madness, becoming unresponsive to his surroundings and unable to recognize his own family. This incapacitation created a power vacuum that a regency council could not fill, as nobles like Richard, Duke of York, began to openly challenge the authority of the Lancastrian court. The loss of France had not only been a military defeat, but a political and psychological one, directly leading to a crisis of succession and legitimacy that would soon plunge the kingdom into the Wars of the Roses. The political and dynastic instability that had plagued the final years of Henry VI's reign erupted into open civil war in the mid-15th century. The conflict, later named the Wars of the Roses, was a prolonged and brutal struggle for the throne between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. The immediate cause was the king's prolonged mental incapacity, which created a power vacuum at the heart of government that could not be filled by his devout and pacifistic nature. This provided an opportunity for Richard, Duke of York, to assert his claim to the throne. Richard's lineage was genealogically superior to the Lancastrian line, descending from Edward III's second and fourth sons, while the Lancastrian claim came through the third son, John of Gaunt. This dynastic dispute provided a legalistic justification for a power struggle that had been festering for years. The nobility quickly coalesced into two distinct factions. The Lancastrian court was dominated by Queen Margaret of Anjou, a formidable and politically active figure who acted as regent for her incapacitated husband. Her chief ally was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a nobleman whose influence and military failures had made him deeply unpopular with the rival faction. The Yorkist cause was led by Richard, Duke of York, who found powerful support in the Neville family, a vast network of northern nobles. The most important of these was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whose immense wealth and military might earned him the epithet, the Kingmaker. His loyalty to the Yorkist cause provided the military strength needed to challenge the crown. The first open hostilities began in May 1455 with the First Battle of St. Albans. This was not a large-scale engagement, but a sharp and decisive skirmish. The Duke of York and the Earl of Warwick led a small army to intercept the royal court. The battle resulted in a swift victory for the Yorkists, and, more importantly, the deaths of key Lancastrian leaders, including the Duke of Somerset. This act of violence made reconciliation between the two houses virtually impossible, as the Yorkist victory effectively cemented the personal feud and established a pattern of vengeance that would define the war. The battle's outcome left Henry VI as a prisoner in the hands of the Duke of York, who now controlled the government. The ensuing years were characterized by a series of uneasy truces and renewed fighting as both sides attempted to solidify their power. Richard of York was briefly named Protector of the Realm, but his authority was tenuous, and Queen Margaret tirelessly worked to undermine his position. The political manoeuvring reached a climax with the Act of Accord in 1460, a parliamentary compromise that disinherited Henry VI's son, Prince Edward, and named Richard of York as the heir to the throne. This was a temporary solution that satisfied no one. It was a political masterpiece of its time, but it was also a direct affront to the Lancastrian queen and her supporters, who immediately mobilized to prevent their prince from being dispossessed. The Act of Accord ultimately guaranteed a continuation of the conflict. The war would no longer be a series of localized skirmishes, but a dynastic struggle for the survival of two royal houses, and the English nobility would be drawn into a cycle of shifting loyalties and brutal vengeance for decades to come. The Yorkist cause, despite its initial successes, was not yet victorious. The political and military manoeuvring reached a critical juncture in late 1460, when Richard, Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield. This victory for the Lancastrians was a severe blow to the Yorkist cause, but it created an opportunity for Richard's eldest son, Edward, to prove his leadership. At only 18 years old, Edward was a formidable figure, a skilled soldier whose charisma and military prowess would ultimately win him the throne. He secured a decisive victory over the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Towton in March 1461, an exceptionally bloody engagement fought in a snowstorm. This victory, coupled with the political support he had cultivated in London, led to his coronation as Edward IV. He was the first monarch of the House of York. Edward's reign, however, was far from secure. The Lancastrian cause, led by the indomitable Queen Margaret of Anjou, continued to resist. Their rebellions, often supported by the remaining Lancastrian nobles and the French crown, forced Edward into a series of military campaigns to consolidate his authority. His early years on the throne were defined by his efforts to hunt down and defeat the Lancastrian strongholds, particularly in the north of England. The capture and imprisonment of the meek Henry VI in 1465 provided a temporary sense of security, but the underlying dynastic conflict remained unresolved. Edward's political control was often tenuous, and he relied heavily on the support of his powerful allies, particularly the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker. The relationship between Edward and Warwick, the man most responsible for placing him on the throne, eventually soured. Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, was a significant cause of friction. Warwick had been negotiating a more politically advantageous marriage to a French princess, and the unexpected union was a direct affront to his authority. This tension, combined with Edward's growing reliance on the Woodville family at court, led Warwick to a dramatic and fateful decision. The kingmaker switched his allegiance, allying with Queen Margaret of Anjou and the exiled Lancastrians. This extraordinary act plunged England back into civil war. Edward was briefly deposed in 1470, and Henry VI was restored to the throne in a period known as the Redemption. The Lancastrian restoration was short-lived. Edward IV, a more capable military leader than his rival, returned from exile in 1471 and swiftly defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, where the kingmaker was killed. He then moved on to the final confrontation with Queen Margaret's forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury, a decisive victory that saw the death of Henry VI's son, Prince Edward. The subsequent death of Henry VI himself, while a prisoner in the Tower of London, effectively extinguished the male line of the House of Lancaster. With his rivals eliminated, Edward IV finally secured his throne. His second reign was a period of greater stability and prosperity, as he worked to rebuild the kingdom's finances and establish a new model of royal governance. His rule, a testament to his military skill and political acumen, marked a crucial period in the consolidation of the Yorkist dynasty and the end of the first phase of the Wars of the Roses. The reign of Richard III began under circumstances of deep political controversy, following the sudden death of his brother, King Edward IV, in April 1483. The succession of Edward's young son, the 12-year-old Edward V, immediately placed the kingdom in a fragile state, with a regency council needed to govern until the boy king came of age. As uncle to the young monarch, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector of England. This position granted him supreme authority over the kingdom's administration and military. His ascent to power was not unopposed. It brought him into direct conflict with the powerful Woodville family, Queen Elizabeth's relatives, who sought to maintain their influence over the young king and the government. Richard acted swiftly and decisively to secure his position. He intercepted the young King Edward V en route to London and had key Woodville allies, including the king's maternal uncle and half-brother, arrested. He then entered the capital with the king, presenting himself as a firm and loyal protector of the realm. The young monarch and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were subsequently placed in the Tower of London, which was then a royal palace as well as a fortress. This move, ostensibly for their safety, effectively removed them from public view and placed them under the Lord Protector's complete control. The political climate quickly shifted in Richard's favour as he consolidated his authority by systematically removing rivals from positions of power. The path to the throne was cleared by a parliamentary act. In June 1483, an assembly of nobles and churchmen issued a legal declaration known as the Titulus Regius. This document, citing a pre-contract between Edward IV and Lady Eleanor Butler, declared his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid. Consequently, all children from that union, including the two young princes in the Tower, were deemed illegitimate and therefore ineligible to inherit the crown. With the line of succession legally nullified, Richard was proclaimed the rightful king. He was formally crowned Richard III at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of July 1483, in a ceremony that solidified his reign in the eyes of the law. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the most enduring mysteries in English history. Following their last public sighting in the summer of 1483, the boys simply vanished. No definitive account of their disappearance exists, and no bodies were discovered at the time. Their disappearance fueled widespread suspicion and provided a powerful tool for Richard's political enemies, who cast him as a ruthless usurper and child murderer. The lack of an official explanation and the subsequent failure to produce the princes only served to galvanize opposition to his reign. This uncertainty was a significant factor in a failed rebellion later that year, led by his former ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. The primary threat to Richard's reign, however, came from outside England. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant to the Lancastrian cause, had been living in exile in Brittany and France. He capitalized on the widespread discontent and rumors surrounding the prince's disappearance, presenting himself as a legitimate alternative to the controversial new king. With financial and military support from the French crown, Henry Tudor launched an invasion of England in 1485. The two forces met at the Battle of Bosworth Field, a swift and decisive engagement that brought the entire conflict to a close. Richard III was killed in the fighting, the last English monarch to die on the battlefield. His death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the start of the Tudor era. The Norman Conquest fundamentally reorganized English society around a new system of land tenure and social hierarchy known as feudalism. At the apex of this structure was the king, who owned all the land in the kingdom. The king did not govern alone but granted large estates, or fiefs, to his most loyal nobles in exchange for their military service. These great magnates, or tenants-in-chief, were then obligated to provide a specific number of knights to serve in the royal army for a set period, typically 40 days a year. This hierarchy extended downwards, as the tenants-in-chief in turn sublet portions of their land to lesser nobles and knights, creating a tiered network of loyalty and obligation. The system was based on oaths of fealty and homage, formal vows that bound a vassal to his lord and created a complex web of mutual responsibilities. While the system was designed to provide military security, it also established a rigid social order with a clear and distinct separation between those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. At the base of this social pyramid were the peasants, the vast majority of the population. Their lives were dictated by the manorial system, the fundamental economic unit of feudal England. A manor was a self-sufficient agricultural estate, typically owned by a lord who held it from a higher noble or the king. The lord's land, known as the domain, was worked by the peasants in exchange for their own small plots of land. These peasants, most of whom were villeins or serfs, were not free. They were legally tied to the land and could not leave the manor without their lord's permission. Their lives were governed by a set of duties and obligations, including labour service on the lord's domain, payments in kind, such as a portion of their harvest, and other fees for using the lord's mill or oven. The daily lives of peasants were harsh and dictated by the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. The year was divided into seasons of ploughing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting, with each task a matter of communal effort. The open field system was the dominant form of agriculture, where large tracts of land were divided into narrow strips, with each peasant family holding scattered strips across different fields. This ensured a more equitable distribution of both good and bad soil. The village itself was a tight-knit community. centered around the parish church, the manor house, and a collection of thatched roof cottages. The church was the focal point of both religious and social life, while the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward, handled local disputes and enforced the customs of the manor. Life was a constant cycle of labor, with little time for rest, but the community was bound together by shared traditions, religious festivals, and a common struggle for survival. The medieval English monarchy was not a static, singular entity, but a dynamic institution centered around the king's household. This was a constantly moving administrative body that traveled with the king as he journeyed across his kingdom. The household was a microcosm of the entire government, encompassing all the officials, courtiers, and servants necessary to support the king's rule. This mobile court served multiple purposes. It allowed the king to demonstrate his authority in different regions, personally oversee the enforcement of his laws, and consume the resources of his vast estates, rather than requiring the produce of the kingdom to be transported to a single capital. The most powerful officials within this household held positions that combined domestic duties with profound political power. The chamberlain, for example, was originally responsible for the king's private chambers and treasury. Over time, this role evolved to include control of the royal finances. The steward oversaw the domestic staff and managed the daily logistics of the household. Similarly, the constable was initially responsible for the stables and military equipment, but grew to command the royal army. These were not mere servants, but powerful magnates who wielded significant influence over the king's decisions. Beyond the immediate household, a more formal administrative structure developed to handle the kingdom's increasingly complex governance. The Privy Council, or Inner Council, was a group of trusted advisors who met privately with the king to discuss matters of state. This council included the highest-ranking nobles and churchmen, and its advice was crucial for royal policy. The royal chapel was also a vital part of the king's administration. It was not only the centre of religious life for the court, but also the birthplace of the kingdom's civil service. The clerics who served as chaplains were often the most educated men in the realm. Their literacy and skills in Latin and law were essential for drafting official documents, maintaining records, and managing the royal chancery. The chancellor, the head of this department, became one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, responsible for the Great Seal and the issuance of all royal writs and charters. The evolution of these roles marked a crucial step in the development of the English state. As the kingdom grew larger and its administration more complex, a more sedentary government was required to supplement the mobile household. The Exchequer, a separate department for royal finances, was established in the 12th century. Its name was derived from the checkered cloth on which royal accountants calculated revenues. This institution, with its fixed location at Westminster, allowed for more systematic and permanent management of the kingdom's treasury. It represented a shift from ad hoc governance to a more professional and bureaucratic system that could function even when the king was absent. The legal system in medieval England was a complex and often brutal reflection of the society it governed. At the local level, justice was administered through a hierarchy of courts, with the manorial court handling most day-to-day disputes and minor crimes. This court, presided over by the Lord Steward, enforced the customs of the manor, settling arguments over land, punishing minor thefts, and resolving issues of debt. For more serious offences, or those involving freemen, the case might be heard at a shire court or hundred court, where a jury of local men would present accusations and decide guilt or innocence. Above these local jurisdictions stood the king's courts, which dealt with major crimes such as murder, rape, and treason, and gradually established a system of common law that applied to the entire kingdom. Crime in the Middle Ages was a constant feature of life, driven by poverty, land disputes, and the absence of a professional police force. Petty theft, such as stealing livestock or grain, was endemic, as was poaching, which was considered a serious crime due to the king's exclusive right to hunt in royal forests. Violent crimes were also commonplace, with murder and assault often stemming from personal feuds or drunken brawls. One of the most severe crimes was high treason, an offence against the king's person or authority, which was punished with the most extreme forms of torture and execution. Other crimes included arson, counterfeiting, and heresy, each with its own specific and often grisly penalties. Punishment was a public spectacle, designed to deter future offenders and reaffirm the social order. For minor crimes, the most common penalties included fines, public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, or a public whipping. Mutilation was also a frequent punishment. A convicted thief might have his hand cut off, while a perjurer might lose his ears. The ultimate punishment was hanging, which was the penalty for a wide range of felonies, from theft to murder. The gallows were a common sight in medieval towns, serving as a constant reminder of the state's power. Those convicted of high treason faced an even more horrific fate. They were typically drawn to the gallows, hanged, and then quartered, with their dismembered body parts displayed as a public warning. The medieval legal system's reliance on informal methods of proof, such as trial by ordeal, was a striking feature of the era. A person accused of a crime might be forced to carry a red-hot iron, or their hand might be plunged into boiling water. If their wounds healed cleanly after a few days, they were considered innocent, as it was believed that God would intervene to protect the innocent. This practice, however, was officially banned by the Church in 1215, leading to a greater reliance on jury trials. The figure of the outlaw captured the medieval imagination. An outlaw was a person who had fled justice and lived outside the law, often in the deep forests of the English countryside. To be declared an outlaw was to lose all legal protection and citizenship. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty. While some were simply common criminals, figures like the legendary Robin Hood became romanticized as heroic figures who stole from the rich to give to the poor. In reality, the life of a medieval outlaw was harsh, short, and defined by constant vigilance against the forces of law and order. Medieval English society was structured by a series of legal and social norms that placed most women in a position of legal subordination to men. A woman's status was typically defined by her relationship to a male authority figure, whether a father, husband, or brother. The legal system, while patriarchal in its foundation, did offer some specific rights. Upon marriage, a woman's property generally passed to her husband's control, yet she retained dower rights, a portion of his estate intended for her support, should she become a widow. Widows, in fact, enjoyed a unique legal status, as they were no longer under a husband's authority and could manage their own property, enter into contracts, and bring legal actions in their own names. This often made a wealthy widow a figure of significant social and economic power. The life of a peasant woman was one of unceasing labor. Her work was essential to the survival of the family and the functioning of the manorial economy. While men were primarily responsible for ploughing and heavy farm work, women worked the land during planting and harvest, managed the household, and were responsible for domestic craft production. This included spinning wool and weaving cloth for the family's clothing, brewing ale, and tending a kitchen garden to supplement their diet. Her labor was not merely a domestic duty, but a vital economic contribution. A peasant woman's world was centered on the village and the family, with her days governed by a relentless cycle of production that supported the manor and the larger feudal structure. For women of the nobility, life was defined by different responsibilities and opportunities. Many noble girls were married off at a young age in politically arranged alliances, with their families using these unions to forge a network of loyalty and power. While a noble woman was expected to produce heirs to secure the family lineage, her duties extended far beyond the domestic sphere. When her husband was away at war or on campaign, she was typically in charge of managing his vast estates. This included overseeing the domain, collecting rents from tenants, and managing the castle's garrison and household. A capable noblewoman could wield immense influence over her husband's lands and finances, and her administrative abilities were often as crucial as his military prowess to the family's fortunes. For women who did not marry, or whose families chose a different path, the church offered a distinct and respected alternative. A woman could become a nun and enter a religious house, where she would dedicate her life to prayer, study, and the service of God. Convents were centers of female intellectual life, providing an environment where women could learn to read and write, and where they could pursue scholarship in a world that offered few such opportunities outside the cloister. The abbess of a powerful convent was a figure of significant authority, managing the house's vast landholdings and often holding a position of influence with the king and other powerful nobles. This spiritual path provided a route to independence and authority that was unavailable to most other women in medieval society. The church in medieval England was a pervasive and powerful institution, its influence extending far beyond the spiritual lives of its adherents. At its core were the monastic orders, communities of men and women who dedicated their lives to prayer and labor under a set of established rules. Monasteries and convents were not merely places of worship, but self-sufficient economic and social hubs. The daily routine was a strict schedule dictated by the canonical hours, a series of fixed prayer services beginning before dawn and continuing throughout the day and night. This constant liturgical cycle provided a disciplined framework for life, a stark contrast to the unpredictable rhythms of the outside world. Beyond their spiritual obligations, these communities were centers of immense temporal power. A large monastery was often the largest landowner in its region, managing vast estates and collecting revenues from tenant farmers. The abbots and abbesses who presided over these houses were powerful figures in their own right, holding significant political influence and acting as advisors to monarchs and nobles. They commanded their own households, administered justice on their lands, and sometimes even provided military service to the king through their tenants. This economic and political authority made the church a parallel power structure to the feudal hierarchy, with its own independent sources of wealth and influence. The intellectual contributions of monasticism were foundational to medieval culture. Within the monastery's scriptorium, monks worked tirelessly to copy and illuminate manuscripts. This painstaking process, often performed in a quiet, dedicated room, was the primary method of preserving ancient texts, both religious and secular. Without their meticulous labor, much of the literary and philosophical heritage of the classical world would have been lost to history. These monastic scribes produced not only Bibles and theological treatises, but also historical chronicles that documented the events of their time, providing an invaluable record of English history. Their work ensured that learning was not extinguished by the political upheavals of the era. Monasteries also served as crucial centers of innovation and social welfare. The monastic orders were at the forefront of agricultural development, employing advanced techniques for crop rotation, land reclamation, and animal husbandry. They drained marshes and cleared forests, transforming unproductive land into fertile farmland, which in turn increased the food supply for the wider population. Furthermore, they fulfilled a vital social function by providing hospitality to travelers, food to the poor, and basic medical care to the sick. The infirmaries attached to many monasteries functioned as early hospitals, offering a level of care that was often unavailable elsewhere. Their presence provided a network of charity and stability that was essential for a society without a formal state-run welfare system. The Church's enduring presence and its multifaceted role as a spiritual, economic, and intellectual force gave it an unparalleled position in medieval life. The economic foundations of medieval England underwent a slow but profound transformation as a system of agrarian self-sufficiency began to give way to a commercial network centered on urban trade. While the manorial economy had long been the bedrock of the kingdom, the 12th and 13th centuries saw the steady growth of towns and the emergence of a distinct merchant class. These urban centers became dynamic hubs of exchange, serving as markets where agricultural surplus was sold and imported goods were acquired. A new form of wealth, based on commerce rather than inherited land, began to accumulate in the hands of this burgeoning mercantile population. The development of major ports like London, Bristol, and Southampton facilitated this expansion, linking England's internal economy to the wider trade routes of Europe. The commodities of this trade were the lifeblood of the new economic order. The kingdom's primary export was wool, a product of unparalleled quality that was in high demand across the continent, particularly in the cloth-making centres of Flanders and Italy. English merchants also exported grain, hides, and tin. In return, the urban centres imported luxury goods that were a testament to the new wealth of the merchant and noble classes. These included fine silks from the East, spices and perfumes from the Mediterranean, and wine from the vineyards of France. This two-way exchange created a complex web of commercial activity, fostering a new class of traders who were skilled in navigation, foreign languages, and finance. To regulate this burgeoning commerce, a system of guilds emerged. These were not merely professional associations, but powerful corporate bodies that exercised control over a town's economic and social life. The earliest were the merchant guilds, which held a monopoly on trade within a town's walls. They set prices, guaranteed the quality of goods, and resolved disputes among members, effectively serving as the town's commercial government. Soon after, craft guilds began to form, each representing a specific trade, such as weavers, bakers, goldsmiths, or blacksmiths. They controlled the production of goods from raw material to finished product, ensuring a consistent standard of quality and preventing external competition. Membership in a craft guild was a structured progression that ensured professional standards and continuity. A young boy would begin his career as an apprentice, living with a master craftsman for a period of several years to learn the trade. Upon completion of his training, he became a journeyman, a skilled worker who travelled and worked for wages. His ultimate goal was to produce a masterpiece, to prove his skill and be accepted as a master, a full member of the guild with his own workshop. The guilds also provided a social safety net, offering support to sick members and their families, and contributing to the upkeep of a local church or chapel. This provided a sense of community and stability outside the traditional feudal order. The economic engine of medieval England was no longer solely driven by the plough, but by the increasingly complex and organised world of trade and craft. The rhythm of life in medieval England was marked not only by the agricultural calendar, but by a dense network of fairs and festivals that offered a temporary escape from the routines of daily labour. These events, a blend of commerce, devotion, and recreation, provided crucial opportunities for both social and economic interaction. Fairs were often granted by royal charter, and they transformed a town into a major commercial hub for a designated period, attracting merchants and consumers from across the kingdom, and in some cases, from continental Europe. They were a break from the localized, guild-regulated trade of the towns, providing a venue for wholesale business and long-distance commerce. The most famous of these events was the Stourbridge Fair, held annually near Cambridge. This was not merely a local market, but a major international emporium, attracting merchants with goods from as far away as Venice and the Baltic. On its sprawling grounds, a temporary town was erected, complete with streets, shops, and even taverns, all regulated by its own special court that administered a form of swift justice, known as the Court of Dusty Feet. Merchants sold everything from fine wool, cloth and leather goods to spices, silks, and wines. The fair was a testament to the scale of international trade and the growing sophistication of England's commercial networks, providing a vital link between the island's economy and the wider world. In contrast to the great fairs, which were primarily commercial, religious festivals and holidays provided the most frequent and widespread forms of recreation. The Christian calendar was filled with feast days honouring various saints, which were often celebrated with a combination of solemn processions and lively public festivities. The major holidays, such as Christmas and Easter, were periods of extended celebration, marked by church services, communal meals, and various forms of entertainment. These events provided much-needed breaks from the harsh realities of peasant life, offering a chance for communal gathering and religious observance. The church played a central role in organising these events, reinforcing its position as a cultural and social anchor for the population. Secular festivities, often tied to the agricultural cycle, were also a fundamental part of the medieval year. Harvest festivals marked the end of the agricultural season, a time for villagers to celebrate the successful gathering of crops with feasting, music, and dancing. May Day celebrations welcomed the arrival of spring, with villagers decorating their homes with flowers and dancing around a maypole. These secular gatherings were important for reinforcing social bonds and providing a sense of community outside of religious life. While life on the manor could be defined by its hardships and rigid social structure, the fairs and festivals offered a series of punctuations, a chance to briefly transcend the ordinary through commerce, faith, and communal celebration. The fundamental unit of social and economic organization in medieval England was the manor. This was not merely a physical estate, but a comprehensive system of land tenure and governance. Its physical layout was a microcosm of the social hierarchy. At its center stood the manor house, the residence of the lord or his representative, often fortified to some degree as a symbol of authority. Nearby was the village itself, a cluster of peasant cottages built of timber and wattle and daub, often situated close to a stream or other water source. The communal infrastructure included the church, which served as the spiritual and social nexus of the community, and the mill, a valuable asset to the lord, as peasants were legally required to have their grain ground there for a fee. The arable land, the most vital component of the manor's economy, was organized into an open field system. This was a communal arrangement, where large fields were divided into long, narrow strips. Peasants cultivated their strips, but the land was collectively managed, with all villagers following the same crop rotation schedule. The land was typically divided into a three-field system: one field for winter crops like wheat or rye, another for spring crops like barley or oats, and the third left fallow to restore its nutrients. This system, while ensuring communal cooperation, also meant that no single peasant could be innovative or independent. Beyond the arable land were the common pastures for livestock grazing, and the waste, which included woodland, marsh, or heath, where peasants could gather firewood or forage for food. Society on the manor was rigidly stratified, defined by the relationship between the peasant and the lord. The vast majority of the rural population were villeins or serfs who were tied to the land they worked. They were not slaves in the classical sense, as they could not be bought or sold, but they were legally bound to the manor and could not leave without the lord's permission. In exchange for the right to cultivate their strips and use the common lands, they owed the lord a set number of days of labour on his domain, the land reserved for his exclusive use. This labour service, known as corvée, was a cornerstone of the manorial economy and included ploughing, sowing, and harvesting the lord's crops. A small portion of the population were freemen who paid rent in cash or goods for their land and were not subject to the same labour obligations. Justice and order within the village were maintained by the manorial court, presided over by the lord or his steward. This court handled local disputes, from petty theft and assault to the enforcement of agricultural rules and the resolution of land inheritance issues. The court's proceedings were a reflection of the unwritten customs of the manor, which were as binding as any law. Beyond the formal structures, social life was bound by a network of cooperation and tradition. The village church served as a place for worship and communal announcements, while the alehouse was a crucial gathering point for gossip, conversation, and the reinforcement of social bonds. The medieval village was a self-contained world, its physical and social organization an intricate and interdependent system that defined the lives of the majority of England's population. The path to knighthood was a formalized process of martial and social education, a rigorous apprenticeship that began in boyhood. From as early as 7 years of age, a young nobleman would leave his family to become a page in the household of a greater lord or a royal court. In this role, he learned basic horsemanship, the rudiments of heraldry, and the etiquette of the aristocratic class. At around 14, he was promoted to a squire, an armed attendant to a knight. As a squire, his training intensified, focusing on swordplay, jousting, and the use of the lance and shield. His duties also involved managing his knight's equipment and assisting him in battle, providing a practical, hands-on education in the realities of combat. and the logistical demands of a military career. The culmination of this training was the ceremony of dubbing, which formally admitted the squire into the order of knighthood. This was a solemn ritual often performed on the eve of a battle or as part of a major festival. The candidate would spend a night in a vigil, praying in a church, before the ceremony the next day. The knight-to-be was then given his armour, and the presiding lord or monarch would strike him on the shoulder or neck with the flat of a sword. This was known as the accolade. Following this, he would take vows to uphold the code of chivalry, a complex set of ideals that went beyond simple military skill. Chivalry was a social and moral framework that dictated behaviour, emphasizing loyalty, piety, honour, and courage, and it was a public declaration of his new status and responsibilities within the feudal hierarchy. Militarily, the knight was a professional heavy cavalryman, a warrior whose primary value lay in the disciplined mounted charge. Feudal armies were organized around the service of these knights, who were obligated to follow their lord into battle for a set period each year. Their equipment was a testament to their military function, consisting of expensive and formidable gear that included chainmail or plate armor, a full helmet, and a variety of offensive weapons, most notably the lance and the longsword. The tactical objective of the knightly charge was to break the enemy's infantry line with the sheer force of men and horses, creating a decisive rupture in their formation. This military dominance defined battlefield strategy for centuries, though its effectiveness was challenged by the rise of new infantry tactics and missile weapons like the longbow. Beyond the battlefield, the ideals of knighthood permeated aristocratic culture. Martial prowess was central to a knight's identity, a reputation earned not only in war but in tournaments, where skill and courage were demonstrated for public recognition. The notion of courtly love was another significant cultural aspect, a highly stylized and often platonic adoration of a noble lady that was celebrated in medieval literature and song. This was not a physical romance, but a refined social ritual that provided a moral and intellectual diversion for the knightly class. The whole system of knighthood, from the squire's training to the ideals of honour, was a self-contained world that shaped the values, social standing, and identity of England's landed aristocracy. The medieval period was an age of monumental architectural achievement, a time when the spiritual and temporal power of the church found its most ambitious expression in stone and glass. The construction of the great cathedrals of England was a project of immense scale, consuming the resources of entire dioceses and demanding the skilled labour of countless masons, carpenters, glassmakers, and artisans. The design and engineering of these structures were guided by two principal considerations: a desire to create a space worthy of divine worship, and a technological ambition to push the boundaries of what was possible with stone. The transition from the solid, earth-bound forms of Romanesque architecture to the soaring, light-filled spaces of Gothic architecture was a fundamental stylistic revolution. Romanesque churches, with their thick walls, rounded arches, and small windows, created an atmosphere of solemn enclosure. In contrast, Gothic architects sought to create a sense of verticality and transcendence. They achieved this through a series of key innovations. The pointed arch directed the weight of the ceiling downwards in a more efficient manner than the rounded arch, allowing for taller and more slender supports. This innovation, combined with the development of the rib vault, which channeled the weight of the roof to specific points, enabled the construction of immense interiors that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. The most crucial innovation, however, was the flying buttress. This external support system, which transferred the outward thrust of the high walls to the ground, freed the interior walls from their load-bearing function. With the weight of the roof supported externally, the walls could be opened up and filled with enormous windows. These vast expanses of glass, often depicting biblical scenes or the lives of saints, transformed the interior of the cathedral. The light streaming through the stained glass created an otherworldly atmosphere, an ethereal glow that was believed to be a physical manifestation of the divine. This was a deliberate theological choice. The cathedral was designed to be a microcosm of heaven, a space where the faithful could feel closer to God. The construction process of a single cathedral could span centuries, an effort that transcended generations. It began with the quarrying of vast quantities of stone, which was then transported, often over great distances, to the construction site. Masons, organized into guilds, were the master craftsmen of this enterprise. Their work was governed by strict rules and a deep knowledge of geometry and engineering, passed down from master to apprentice. The final product was a synthesis of design, engineering, and profound spiritual devotion, a testament to a collective faith that viewed the construction of such a magnificent building as an act of worship in itself. The great cathedrals stood as the literal and figurative pinnacles of medieval English society, a permanent record of its faith, wealth, and technological ambition etched into the very landscape. The castle was the central symbol of power and authority in medieval England, a fortress that dominated the landscape and a structure that served a multitude of functions beyond military defense. The evolution of castle design reflects the changing nature of warfare and the growing power of the monarchy. The earliest Norman castles were of the motte and bailey type, a simple but effective design of a wooden keep built atop an artificial earth mound, the motte, surrounded by a courtyard, the bailey, and a defensive ditch. These were quick to construct and served as a visible and immediate assertion of Norman control over a conquered land. They were not designed to withstand long sieges, but were rather points of military control, providing a secure base for a small garrison and a refuge for the lord's household. Over time, these temporary structures were replaced by more formidable stone fortresses. The shell keep was an early transition, a circular stone wall built on top of the original motte, while the keep itself remained a wooden structure. This was soon followed by the development of the stone keep, a massive, rectangular stone tower that served as the primary residence and the last line of defence. Castles like Rochester and Dover represent the pinnacle of this design, their thick walls and fortified gates a testament to the new level of security and permanence that the Norman and early Angevin kings sought to establish. The later Plantagenet period saw the development of the concentric castle, a design that was a revolution in defensive engineering. These castles, such as Caerphilly and Harlech, were a series of nested walls, one inside the other, with towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The absence of a central keep meant that the entire fortress was a fighting machine, designed to withstand the most sophisticated siege weaponry of the era. The concentric design provided a multi-layered defense that was nearly impossible to breach, forcing besieging forces to assault each wall in succession while under continuous fire from the inner layers of the fortress. Beyond its military function, the castle was a crucial administrative centre. It was here that the lord of the manor held his court, collected rents, and administered justice. The castle's great hall served as the primary gathering place for the lord's household and the site of banquets and feasts. The castle also served as a royal residence and a symbol of a king's authority, and it was in these great stone halls that the monarch would receive ambassadors, hold councils, and dispense patronage. The daily life within the castle walls was a complex operation. The garrison maintained constant vigilance, while the lord's household, a large staff of servants, cooks, and squires, ensured the daily routines of the powerful lord were met. The castle was the physical and symbolic heart of medieval power, a multifaceted institution that simultaneously served as a military fortress, an administrative hub, and a home for the elite. Medieval combat was governed by a set of tactical principles that evolved with the introduction of new technologies and fighting styles. In the Anglo-Saxon period, the primary military formation was the shield wall, a dense, disciplined infantry block where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their large, round shields interlocking to form a nearly impenetrable barrier. This formation relied on unit cohesion and physical strength, absorbing the shock of enemy charges and allowing fighters to engage with swords, axes, and spears in a grinding close-quarters engagement. The success of the shield wall was dependent on maintaining its integrity, as any breach could lead to a swift and catastrophic collapse of the entire line. It was the defining tactic of Anglo-Saxon military power, and battles were often won or lost based on a formation's ability to hold its ground. The Norman Conquest fundamentally altered these battlefield dynamics with the introduction of professional heavy cavalry. The mounted charge of the armoured knight became the decisive military manoeuvre. Knights, equipped with chainmail and a kite-shaped shield, would form a tight wedge and charge at speed, using the lance to devastating effect. This tactic was designed to shatter infantry formations and exploit any weakness in the enemy's line. The psychological impact of 1,000 galloping horses and armoured men was as important as the physical force of the charge itself. Infantry, while still a crucial component of an army, was often used to support the cavalry, holding a line or providing missile fire with bows and crossbows to soften up enemy positions before the knight's assault. Beyond open-field combat, siegecraft was a central component of medieval warfare, as control of a region was determined by the ability to capture its fortified places. The siege was a protracted and methodical affair that required a range of specialized technology. The trebuchet was a powerful siege engine that used a counterweight to launch large projectiles, such as rocks and incendiary materials, over city walls. Its mechanical precision and immense power made it the most feared weapon of siege warfare. To get troops over a fortress's walls, attackers constructed siege towers, multi-story wooden structures on wheels that were rolled up to the enemy's defences, allowing infantry to pour onto the battlements from a superior height. For direct assault on a gate, a battering ram, a massive log swung by dozens of men, was used to pound the structure until it splintered. When frontal assault was too costly, sappers and miners were deployed to undermine a fortress's foundations. These skilled labourers would dig tunnels beneath the walls, propping up the excavated earth with timber supports. Once the tunnel was complete, the supports would be set on fire, causing the ground above to collapse and the wall to fall. This method was slow and dangerous, but proved highly effective against even the most formidable stone fortresses, demonstrating that medieval warfare was a matter of engineering and logistics as much as it was of courage and strength. The medieval period saw a rich tapestry of cultural expression, extending from the solemn halls of monasteries to the bustling public spaces of villages and towns. Music in medieval England was deeply intertwined with both religious and secular life. The dominant musical form was the Gregorian chant, a monophonic style of singing used in church services. Its simple, unadorned melodies were intended to create a sense of spiritual contemplation and devotion. In contrast, secular music was more varied, performed by minstrels and troubadours who travelled from court to court. Their repertoire included ballads, love songs, and epic tales, often accompanied by instruments like the lute, harp, and fiddle. This music served as a form of popular entertainment, chronicling heroic deeds and romantic narratives that were accessible to the wider public. Artistic expression was primarily driven by religious themes and the patronage of the church and nobility. Manuscript illumination, the intricate decoration of handwritten books, was a major art form. Monks and skilled lay artists created dazzling works, often using vibrant pigments and gold leaf to illustrate sacred texts. These books, such as the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, were not just works of art, but also theological statements, with each detail carrying symbolic meaning. Wall paintings in churches and private chapels also served as a form of visual instruction for a largely illiterate population, depicting scenes from the Bible and the lives of saints. The most profound artistic legacy, however, is found in the stained glass windows of the great cathedrals, which transformed light into a medium for divine narrative. These immense panels of coloured glass depicted complex biblical stories, allowing the illiterate to read the scriptures through a cascade of filtered light and sacred images. Recreation and leisure activities varied significantly by social class. For the nobility, life was dominated by martial pursuits and formal courtly events. Jousting, a highly ritualized combat between two mounted knights, was a major spectacle, showcasing military skill and aristocratic prestige. Other noble pastimes included hunting, a highly organized affair involving trained falcons and packs of hounds, which was both a sport and a means of demonstrating social status. For the common people, recreation was less formal but no less integral to daily life. Archery was a widely practiced skill, mandated by royal decree for national defense, but it also served as a popular form of competition and entertainment. Other common games included wrestling, various forms of ball games, and dice, which provided a brief escape from the rigors of agrarian life. Seasonal and religious festivals offered the most significant opportunities for communal recreation, with feast days and local fairs bringing communities together for singing, dancing, and communal celebration. These various forms of cultural expression, from sacred music to popular games, were a fundamental part of the medieval experience, weaving together the spiritual, social, and martial aspects of life. Justice in medieval England was a complex and fragmented system, operating across multiple tiers of authority. The most fundamental tier was the manorial court, which dealt with the day-to-day legal issues of the village. Presided over by the Lord's Steward, these courts handled disputes over land, petty theft, minor assaults, and violations of manorial custom. Their primary function was to maintain order and settle conflicts among the peasantry, with fines or minor punishments serving as the most common verdicts. This local justice system was a crucial part of the feudal order, as it ensured the smooth operation of the manor and upheld the lord's authority. Above the manorial courts were the ecclesiastical courts, which held exclusive jurisdiction over religious and moral offences. The church's legal system, known as canon law, governed cases of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual misconduct, as well as disputes involving clergy. The punishments meted out by these courts were often spiritual, such as excommunication or penance, but could also include physical penalties. The church's power to operate its own separate legal system was a frequent point of contention with the monarchy, particularly concerning the legal status of the clergy. The most significant development in medieval justice was the establishment of common law by the English monarchy. Under Henry II, royal justices travelled the country on a regular circuit, bringing the king's justice to every shire. These justices applied a single body of law, based on precedent and custom, which began to supersede the diverse and often contradictory local laws that had existed since the Anglo-Saxon period. This process of legal centralization was a key component of building a unified kingdom, as it made the king's law the supreme authority and created a consistent legal framework across the entire realm. The introduction of the jury system, where a body of local men would present indictments and determine facts, was another foundational element of this new system, replacing older methods of proof. Punishment for offences was designed to be both a deterrent and a public spectacle. For minor crimes, the accused might be placed in the stocks or the pillory, a public humiliation intended to shame the offender before the community. More serious crimes, such as robbery or murder, often resulted in public execution by hanging. For the gravest offence, high treason, the penalty was drawing and quartering, a particularly brutal and dismembering form of capital punishment. In cases where guilt was in question, the legal system sometimes resorted to trial by ordeal, a method that relied on divine judgment. A person's innocence might be proven by surviving an ordeal, such as handling a hot iron or being submerged in water. This practice, however, was officially suppressed by the Church in the 13th century, solidifying the move towards a more evidence-based system of law. Food in medieval England was a powerful indicator of social status, with a stark divide between the diets of the nobility and the common people. For the vast majority of the population, the peasant diet was simple and largely based on what could be grown on the manor. The primary staples were cereals, mainly oats, barley, and rye, which were used to make bread, pottage, and ale. Pottage was a thick soup, or stew made from grains, peas, beans, and vegetables, a common and nutritious dish for the poor. Meat was a rare luxury for the peasantry, typically consumed only on feast days or after the autumn slaughter. Their sustenance was rooted in the land they worked, with a diet dictated by the seasons and the meagre harvests. In stark contrast, the feasts of the nobility were extravagant affairs designed to showcase wealth and power. The noble diet was rich in meat, including venison, wild boar, and various types of fowl, supplemented by fish, especially during periods of religious fasting. Spices, a costly import from the East, were used liberally to flavor dishes and demonstrate the host's wealth and global connections. The medieval feast was a highly ritualized event with multiple courses, each presented with great ceremony, and often accompanied by music and entertainment. Food was not merely for sustenance, but a social tool used to build alliances, reinforce social hierarchies, and display aristocratic status. The Church exerted a profound influence on the medieval diet through its dietary restrictions and customs. The most significant of these was the Lenten fast, a 40-day period leading up to Easter, during which the consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy was forbidden. Fish became a staple during this time, driving a robust trade in herring and other types of seafood. The Church's calendar, filled with fast days and feast days, punctuated the year with cycles of abstinence and abundance, creating a rhythm to medieval life that transcended social class. These religious mandates shaped not only what people ate, but also the agricultural and commercial systems that supplied their food. Food production and consumption were central to the social fabric of the period. The Lenten fast was a communal act of piety, uniting the entire population in a shared experience of self-denial. Conversely, the great festivals such as Harvest Festival or Christmas were communal celebrations that brought together all members of a community. On these occasions, lords might provide meat and ale for their tenants, a temporary blurring of social lines that reinforced the bonds of the manorial system. These food traditions and rituals underscore the interconnectedness of medieval society, where what was on the plate was always a reflection of one's place in the world. Clothing in medieval England served as a powerful visual signifier of an individual's place within the rigid social hierarchy. For the vast majority of the population, fashion was a matter of practicality and necessity. The peasantry wore garments that were simple in cut and durable in material, designed to withstand the rigors of manual labor. Their clothing was primarily made from coarse, undyed wool for warmth and locally grown linen for undergarments. Men wore a loose-fitting tunic, or coat, over a shirt and secured with a rope belt, paired with simple hose tied at the waist. Women wore a long tunic or kirtle, often in a muted shade of brown, grey, or undyed off-white, covered by an apron. Head coverings such as wimples or simple cloth hoods were worn by married women to show modesty. Their apparel was functional, a reflection of their agrarian existence and limited resources. As one moved up the social scale, clothing became more elaborate and a key instrument for displaying wealth. The rising merchant class and urban artisans could afford better quality fabrics and a wider range of colours. They wore fitted tunics and gowns, and their clothing might be embellished with simple embroidery or metal buttons. These groups often emulated the styles of the nobility on a smaller scale, using their dress to signal their growing economic status within urban communities. The apparel of the nobility and royal court was designed for spectacle and prestige. Their garments were crafted from luxurious imported materials that signified their rank and international connections. Silk, velvet, and brocade, often woven with gold and silver threads, were brought from Italy and the Byzantine Empire. The most fashionable colours were bright and vibrant, created using expensive imported dyes like cochineal for reds and woad for blues. Both men and women wore multiple layers, with long flowing outer garments, elaborate headdresses, and intricate embroidery. The display of expensive furs, such as ermine and sable, on cloaks and trims was another clear marker of aristocratic power and privilege. To maintain this visible social order and prevent the lower classes from dressing above their station, the monarchy enacted sumptuary laws. These legal codes dictated what materials, colours, and styles of clothing could be worn by specific ranks of society. For example, laws might restrict the use of silks, velvets, or certain types of furs to only dukes, earls, or other high-ranking nobles. The use of gold and silver embroidery was also regulated. These laws were a form of social control, a way for the ruling class to reinforce its exclusive status and prevent the blurring of lines between the gentry and the common people. While difficult to enforce universally, they reveal a culture where a person's identity was worn on their sleeve, literally. The continuous evolution of courtly fashion, often influenced by styles from France, ensured that the visual divide between classes remained a central aspect of medieval life. The intellectual life of medieval England was initially centered in monastic schools and cathedral chapters. These institutions served as the primary repositories of classical knowledge, where monks and clergy meticulously copied manuscripts and studied Latin texts on theology and rhetoric. The curriculum was narrow, focused on training men for the service of the church, but it preserved the fragments of learning that had survived the fall of the Roman Empire. By the 12th century, a significant intellectual shift began with the establishment of universities in Oxford and later Cambridge. These centres of higher learning grew out of informal associations of masters and students, formalised into corporate bodies that offered a structured curriculum. The study was organised into the 7 liberal arts: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Upon completion, students could proceed to advanced studies in theology, law, or medicine. Medieval medicine was a blend of inherited classical theories and practical, often superstitious, folk remedies. The dominant medical framework was humoral theory, an ancient Greek concept that posited health was dependent on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Physicians, trained in the universities, sought to restore this balance through diet, bleeding, or purging. The practice of medicine was highly stratified. While university-educated physicians were confined to the intellectual application of theory, a lower class of practitioners, including barber surgeons, handled practical procedures such as bloodletting, bone setting, and tooth extraction. Monastic infirmaries were important centres for herbal medicine, as monks and nuns cultivated gardens of medicinal plants and documented their uses in herbals. A critical catalyst for intellectual growth was the translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries. European scholars gained access to a vast body of classical Greek and Roman knowledge that had been preserved and expanded upon in the Islamic world. Works by Aristotle on logic and natural philosophy, and texts from ancient mathematicians and astronomers were translated from Arabic and Greek into Latin. These new ideas challenged and enriched the existing curriculum, leading to a new intellectual approach known as scholasticism. Scholars like Roger Bacon at Oxford championed the use of reason and observation to understand the natural world, laying the groundwork for later empirical inquiry. The study of natural philosophy was deeply intertwined with theology, as scholars viewed the scientific investigation of the universe as a means of understanding the mind of God. This intellectual flourishing, fueled by the influx of new texts, transformed the academic landscape and expanded the boundaries of knowledge in medieval England. The medieval period witnessed a profound linguistic transformation that saw the English language evolve dramatically. The Norman Conquest of 1066 was the primary catalyst, as it introduced Anglo-Norman French as the language of the ruling class, government, and law. For over 2 centuries, England operated as a trilingual society. Latin was used for official documents and the church, French for the aristocracy and the court, and English, descended from the Old English of the Anglo-Saxons, remained the spoken tongue of the common people. This prolonged linguistic separation, however, was not an eradication. English survived and was fundamentally reshaped, absorbing a vast vocabulary of French and Latin words, enriching its syntax and expanding its expressive capabilities. By the 14th century, English had re-emerged as a sophisticated language, a fusion of its Germanic roots with Norman influences. This linguistic revival coincided with the emergence of a new literary culture distinct from the Old English tradition. The heroic epic, exemplified by works like Beowulf, gave way to new genres that reflected the social and cultural changes of the era. the romance became a highly popular literary form. Originally a French import, these narratives told tales of knightly adventure, chivalry, and courtly love, often set in idealized, distant lands. They were a staple of aristocratic entertainment and were circulated widely in both French and English. Alongside these, the ballad, a shorter, more direct form of storytelling, gained popularity among all social classes. Ballads were typically oral works, passed down through generations, recounting dramatic events, historical figures, or folk heroes such as Robin Hood. A pivotal figure in this literary renaissance was Geoffrey Chaucer, a poet who consciously chose to write in the vernacular. His decision to employ the language of the people rather than the established literary languages of Latin or French was a bold statement that elevated English to a new status. Chaucer's masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, is a collection of framed narratives told by a diverse group of pilgrims travelling to Canterbury. The work's genius lies in its detailed portrayal of medieval society, from the knight and the prioress to the miller and the pardoner, capturing the dialects, customs, and social tensions of the time. Chaucer's use of the East Midlands dialect, the language of the influential London region, helped to establish a standard for the developing English language, providing it with a coherent literary voice. His work demonstrated that English was capable of producing literature of profound depth and sophistication, paving the way for future generations of writers and solidifying its place as a literary language. The Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August 1485 marked the definitive conclusion of the Wars of the Roses and the end of England's medieval era. This engagement was not a grand, sprawling battle, but a swift and decisive affair that eliminated the last Yorkist king, Richard III, and brought Henry Tudor to the throne. Henry's claim was tenuous, a distant lineage through the House of Lancaster, but his victory on the battlefield legitimized his right to rule. He was crowned Henry VII on the field. A symbolic act that underscored his authority was won through conquest. This military triumph was the first step in a long process of consolidating power and ending the chronic political instability that had plagued England for over 30 years. Henry VII's primary challenge was to secure his dynasty and prevent any resurgence of the defeated Yorkist cause. His first strategic move was his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This union symbolically merged the warring houses of Lancaster and York, uniting their respective red and white roses into the Tudor emblem. This political act was foundational to his rule, publicly healing the dynastic rift and undermining the legitimacy of any future claimants from either side. He dealt with remaining rivals through a combination of political suppression and calculated clemency. He executed key Yorkist nobles who posed a direct threat and imprisoned others, but he also co-opted many into his government, ensuring their loyalty through patronage and position. To address the financial instability of the preceding reigns, Henry implemented a series of rigorous administrative and fiscal reforms. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied heavily on Parliament for subsidies, Henry sought to make the crown financially independent. He revived and ruthlessly enforced forgotten feudal dues, increased custom duties, and, most notably, used the Court of Star Chamber to prosecute wealthy nobles who resisted his authority, imposing heavy fines that filled the royal coffers. This aggressive accumulation of wealth was not an act of avarice, but a deliberate political strategy. It ensured the monarchy was not beholden to the whims of the nobility and could fund a professional military, reducing its dependence on private armies that had fueled the recent civil wars. Henry VII's reign saw the gradual dismantling of the feudal system as a primary mechanism of governance and warfare. The practice of powerful lords maintaining large retinues of armed men, a key source of instability during the Wars of the Roses, was curtailed. The new king enacted strict legislation against livery and maintenance, essentially outlawing private armies. This shift consolidated military power in the hands of the monarch and centralized authority in a way that had been unimaginable during the tumultuous Plantagenet era. The political order was no longer defined by the shifting allegiances of a landed aristocracy, but by a powerful centralized state under a new dynasty. With the establishment of the Tudor line and the systematic subjugation of the old nobility, the long and chaotic period of medieval kingship came to a close, replaced by the foundations of a new kind of monarchy and a new chapter in England's history.